Hello, I'm Arthur Reed. Welcome to the World War II History Channel, where we explore the pivotal moments and untold stories of the greatest generation. Listen to the soft, rhythmic hum of a carriage wheel on damp cobblestones, fading slowly into the evening mist, carrying with it the last golden embers of a world that truly believed its peace would last forever. Close your eyes for a moment, and let us travel back to a time before the great storms. Let us walk together through the twilight of the late 19th century, into the long, beautiful summer of the Old World. It is a quiet evening in Europe. The air is cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming linden trees and roasted chestnuts. In the grand, sweeping avenues of Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, the gas lamps are beginning to flicker to life. One by one, little stars of warm, orange light bloom against the gathering dusk. Underneath these gentle lights, life moves at a slow, graceful pace. People are sitting at small outdoor cafes, sipping warm coffee from porcelain cups, wrapped in thick wool coats, murmuring to one another in hushed, comforting voices. You can hear the distant, melodic notes of a waltz drifting from an open window, mingling with the soft rustle of autumn leaves sweeping across the pavement. It is a world that feels incredibly safe. It is a world wrapped in a blanket of delicate illusions, where mothers tuck their children into bed, whispering promises of a tomorrow that will look exactly like today. But if you look closely, past the golden glow of the street lamps and the beautiful music, you can see the faint, creeping shadows. In the quiet, heavy-curtained rooms of the Chancellery in Berlin, aging men with tired eyes sit behind large oak desks. The hearth fires cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. These are the diplomats, the silent caretakers of a fragile peace. They are men who remember a time when the continent was a jigsaw puzzle of quiet agreements, and visible handshakes, and gentle promises. They are watching a delicate web, woven decades ago by an old architect of peace, slowly begin to unravel. Imagine an old man, a forgotten ambassador, sitting alone in his study late at night. The house is entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, soothing tick of a grandfather clock in the hallway. He dips his heavy fountain pen into a glass well of black ink, his hand trembling just slightly, not from the cold, but from a profound, deep-seated worry. He begins to write a letter to his daughter, who is away in the countryside. He does not write to her of military numbers, or grand geopolitical strategies, or shifting borders. He writes to her of feelings. He writes, "My dearest child, the garden looks so peaceful tonight, but I cannot shake the feeling that the seasons are turning too quickly. There is a chill in the corridors of power. The old friends who used to write to us from across the borders have grown quiet. We used to hold hands in the dark, all of us nations, to make sure no one fell. But lately, I feel our hands slipping." This was the private fear of Germany, a fear not born of malice or sudden aggression, but of a quiet, creeping loneliness. Imagine what it feels like to live in a house right in the center of a very large, very crowded neighborhood. For a long time, you felt secure because you had an understanding with the neighbors on your left, and the neighbors on your right. You were all bound together by a beautifully intricate, fragile spiderweb of promises. But then, the old man who spun that web passed away. The men who took his place were younger, heavier-handed, and clumsy. They did not understand how gently you had to touch the silk to keep it from tearing. And so, the threads began to snap. Slowly, silently, the invisible bonds of friendship faded. To the west, across the quiet rivers and rolling green hills, the old rival, France, began to look past Germany, reaching out a hand toward the vast, snowy expanse of Russia in the east. When those two distant hands finally clasped, a profound, icy shiver ran down the spine of every German diplomat, every father reading the morning paper, every mother watching her sons play in the yard. They called it by a soft, terrifying word, Einkreisung. Encirclement. It was not a sudden panic. It was a slow, melancholic claustrophobia. It was the feeling of sitting in a warm room and watching the trees outside grow taller and thicker, slowly blocking out the light, until you realize you are entirely closed in. In the diaries of ordinary citizens from that time, we do not find the bloodthirsty cries of conquerors. We find the quiet, anxious whispers of trapped souls. We find entries written by candlelight, expressing a deep, sorrowful realization that the world they loved was quietly turning its back on them. Think of a young schoolteacher in a small Bavarian village. She sits by her window, looking out at the sleepy, snow-covered roofs of her neighbors. She writes in a journal about the changing tone of the letters her brother sends from the capital. She writes, "He says the world is growing colder. He says that when he walks past the foreign embassies, the doors are shut a little tighter, and the smiles of the guards do not reach their eyes." She looks down at the sleeping faces of her pupils the next morning, feeling a sudden, fierce urge to protect them from a storm she cannot even see yet, a storm gathering beyond the mountains. History is so rarely about the grand, sweeping decisions of villains in dark rooms. It is almost always about the deeply human, quiet desperation of people who are simply afraid of losing their home, of losing their light, of being left completely alone in the dark. The men in Berlin felt the walls closing in. They felt the heavy, suffocating weight of being surrounded. Every defensive wall built by their neighbors felt like a cage being assembled around them. Every quiet alliance made in the shadows felt like a lock turning on a door they could no longer open. These old empires were entirely built on secrets, on hushed conversations in dimly lit parlors, and hidden letters tucked away in wooden drawers. It takes a certain kind of quiet dedication to unearth those secrets, to peer beneath the grand tapestry of dates and battles and find the fragile, beating human hearts underneath. Just as those old diplomats sought out quiet rooms to decipher the hidden truths of their world, I know many of you seek out quiet corners to understand the deeper, uncensored layers of our past. There is a profound joy in finding a community that truly cares about the forgotten whispers of history, a place where we can look at the raw, unfiltered truth of the days that shaped our world. I have created a gentle, welcoming space just like that on our Patreon. It is a quiet harbor for history lovers, where we dive into uncensored stories, raw, historical deep dives, and entirely ad-free podcasts that take you further into the past. It is a place for us to gather, much like sitting around a warm fire, sharing the stories that platforms like this one often cannot show. If you feel drawn to these hidden depths, I would be so honored to welcome you there. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As we return to the fading light of that old world, let us walk again down those cobblestone streets. It is getting later now. The carriages are fewer, and the music from the cafes has softly drifted away into silence. The night is deepening. The people of Europe are going to sleep. In their warm beds, under heavy quilts, they dream of tomorrow. They dream of simple things. The smell of fresh bread in the morning. The sound of children laughing in the town square. The comfort of a familiar routine. They do not know that the men in the high offices are still awake. In those quiet rooms, the map of Europe is spread across the tables. It is no longer a map of shared fields and open roads. To the tired, frightened eyes looking down at it, it has become a cage. The lines drawn on the paper seem to pulse with a quiet, menacing energy. The beautifully fragile web of peace is entirely gone, replaced by a cold, invisible ring of steel. There is a tragic, poetic sadness to this moment. The leaders of Germany did not look at the map and feel the thrill of a hunter. They looked at the map and felt the suffocating panic of the hunted. Every day that passed without action felt like a day the invisible noose was pulled just a fraction of an inch tighter. They convinced themselves that the only way to survive the coming darkness was to be the ones to strike the match, even if it meant setting their own beautiful house on fire. And so, the long, golden summer of the old world begins to close its eyes. The delicate peace, held together for so long by the gentle hopes of ordinary people and the exhausted hands of aging diplomats, breathes its final, weary sighs. Picture a solitary lamplighter making his way down a long, quiet avenue in Berlin. He carries a long wooden pole, moving gracefully from lamp to lamp. With a soft, quiet click, he extinguishes the gaslight. The warm orange glow fades, surrendering to the deep, velvet blue of the encroaching night. He walks further down the street, putting out the lights, one by one. The shadows stretch out, reaching across the cobblestones, wrapping the city in a cold, silent embrace. The old lights are fading. The beautiful illusion of safety is quietly slipping away into the mist. And in the dark, silent hours of the night, the world waits, breathless and unknowingly, for the coming storm. Rest now, let the quiet of the night settle around you, as we prepare to turn the page, and step softly into the shadows of what is to come. Imagine the heavy, quiet loneliness of a child who believes he must wear a suit of armor just to be loved. Welcome back, my friend, to the quiet shadows of our history. Settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let the gentle current of the past carry you away. Tonight, we are going to look behind the heavy velvet curtains of a grand palace. We are going to step softly into the private, aching heart of a man who held the fate of millions in his hands, yet spent his entire life running from his own shadow. When we think of the great empires before the war, we often picture men carved from stone. We see statues of bronze, stern faces looking out over vast armies, chests covered in sparkling metals. We are taught to see them as untouchable titans who moved pieces on a grand chessboard with cold, calculating precision. But history is never truly made by statues. It is made by fragile, breathing human beings. And the story of Germany's role in the approaching storm cannot be told without understanding the deeply personal, quiet agony of its leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. To understand him, we must not look at the roaring emperor on the balcony. We must look at the little boy in the nursery. Imagine a cold, gray morning in Prussia. The winter wind is howling outside the tall, frost-covered windows of the palace, but inside, the room is quiet. Too quiet. A young boy stands before a mirror. His name is Wilhelm. He is a prince, born to inherit a magnificent, powerful kingdom. But as he looks at his reflection, he does not see power. He sees only what is broken. When Wilhelm was born, the entry into the world was harsh and traumatic. In the desperate moments of his birth, his left arm was severely injured. As he grew, that arm did not. It remained small, weak, and withered, a secret he would spend his entire life trying to hide. In our time, a mother's instinct is to wrap a struggling child in love, to assure them that they are perfect just the way they are. But the royal courts of the 19th century were not warm places. They were places of strict perfection, of martial pride, where a future king was expected to be a flawless warrior. His mother, an English princess of high intellect and exacting standards, looked at her son's arm and felt a terrible, heavy disappointment. She could not hide the sorrow in her eyes when she looked at him. And children, with their quiet, observant hearts, always know when they are a disappointment. Think of the tears shed in the dark of that nursery. Think of the agonizing, cruel medical treatments he endured as a boy. Doctors would strap him into strange, heavy contraptions of leather and iron, stretching his arm, hoping to force it to grow. Imagine the little prince, lying in his bed at night, his tiny body aching, the metal cold against his skin, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and wondering why he was not good enough to be loved exactly as he was. His childhood tutor, a strict, uncompromising man, decided that the only way to save the boy was to force him to conquer his weakness. Wilhelm was placed upon the back of a horse before he could properly balance. Because he had no strength in his left arm, he would slip and fall heavily to the ground, time and time again. He would weep, his small hands bruised, his pride shattered. And time again, he was picked up, weeping, and placed back into the saddle. He learned a deeply tragic lesson in those dusty riding rings. He learned that pain must be swallowed. He learned that weakness is unforgivable. And he learned that to survive in a world that demands perfection, you must build a fortress around your heart. And so, the boy grew into a man, and the man placed a crown of steel upon his head to hide the crown of thorns that pierced his soul. When he became the Kaiser, Wilhelm became a master of illusion. If you watch the old, flickering silent films of him, you will notice something deeply poignant. He is always positioning himself carefully. He rests his left hand upon the hilt of a gleaming sword, or he tucks it discreetly into the pocket of a heavy, fur-lined coat. He is always holding something, a pair of riding crops, a pair of gloves, to disguise the weakness. There is a quiet, heartbreaking story found in the diaries of his personal tailors. When they came to the private rooms of the palace to fit his magnificent uniforms, the atmosphere was always hushed, intensely respectful, and completely unspoken. The tailors would meticulously cut the sleeves of his tunics, measuring the fabric down to the very last thread, sewing subtle pads and clever seams so that, to the outside world, both arms looked entirely equal. In those quiet fitting rooms, surrounded by scraps of beautiful wool and silk, the Emperor of Germany was just a vulnerable man, relying on the gentle kindness of a tailor to protect his dignity. He overcompensated for his physical frailty by building a persona of overwhelming, roaring strength. He spoke loudly. He wore the fiercest, most intimidating helmets. He commissioned massive, towering ships of steel to sail the oceans, perhaps hoping that if his navy was the strongest, no one would notice that the man commanding them was secretly afraid. But beneath the heavy gold braid and the sharp uniforms, he was still the little boy who just wanted to belong. He desperately craved the affection of his royal relatives. He wanted his grandmother, the formidable Queen Victoria of England, to look at him with pride. He wanted his cousins in Russia and Britain to treat him as an equal, to invite him into their warm circle of friendship. Instead, they often found him exhausting. They whispered about him behind closed doors. They laughed at his grand, boastful speeches. During the long, lazy summers when the royal cousins would gather in Denmark or on the Isle of Wight, Wilhelm would arrive on his magnificent yacht, trying so hard to impress them. He was like a child crashing a quiet garden party, speaking too loudly, trying too desperately to be loved, only to be met with polite, icy smiles. Every slight, every unreturned letter, every gentle mockery felt like a dagger to his fragile heart. It takes an immense, quiet dedication to piece together these deeply personal fragments of the past. To look past the grand treaties and the loud declarations of war, and find the frightened boy hiding inside the armor. Unearthing these delicate human stories, reading the fading ink of old diaries, translating the private letters of tailors and tutors, and preserving the true, emotional heartbeat of history, carries an immense weight of research and time. It is a labor of profound love. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys into the past, and if you would like to help support the massive research it takes to craft these stories, I have created a small Ko-Fi page where you can leave a tip, even as little as $1. It is just a gentle tip jar to help keep this history alive, to ensure we can keep reading the letters and unearthing the whispers of those who came before us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It would mean the world to me, as a caring friend offering these stories to you, to have your support in preserving them. Let us return to the quiet halls of the palace. It is late at night. The fires in the hearths have burned down to a soft, glowing red. The Kaiser is alone in his private study. The heavy, gold-braided uniform has been taken off and draped carefully over a wooden chair. He sits in a comfortable robe, staring into the dying embers. In the absolute silence of the room, there is no need for illusions. His left arm aches with a dull, familiar throb. The burdens of his empire press down upon his shoulders like physical weights. We must understand that Wilhelm's personal insecurities were tragically intertwined with the insecurities of his nation. Germany, at that time, was a very young empire. Like its Kaiser, it was desperate to prove itself. It was an industrial giant, bursting with poetry, science, and magnificent culture, yet it felt constantly looked down upon by the older, more established empires of France and Britain. The nation and the man were a perfect, tragic mirror of one another. Both felt they had arrived late to the feast of the world. Both felt they had to puff out their chests, to speak with voices of thunder, so that no one would dare question their strength. Wilhelm believed that if he ever showed a moment of hesitation, a moment of gentleness, the surrounding nations would fall upon Germany like wolves. He did not want a massive, destructive war. In his private heart, he was terrified of conflict. He loved the pageantry of armies, the beautiful uniforms, the rhythmic marching in the parades, but he deeply feared the unpredictable, chaotic reality of actual bloodshed. He played a dangerous game of geopolitical chess, constantly moving his pieces forward, threatening and blustering, always hoping the other side would back down, always hoping to win a bloodless victory that would finally earn him the respect he so deeply starved for. But a man who builds his entire life upon a foundation of aggressive posturing eventually traps himself. When you wear a frightening mask for too long, the world begins to treat you as a monster. Think of him sitting there by the fire, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. He is surrounded by aides and generals who tell him that he must be strong, that the iron ring around Germany is tightening, that to step back now would be an unbearable humiliation. He remembers the boy falling off the horse in the dust. He remembers the cold, disappointed eyes of his mother. He cannot step back. He cannot show weakness. He must be the Iron King they demand him to be. The tragedy of the Kaiser is the tragedy of a man who built a magnificent, terrifying machine of steel to protect his deeply wounded heart, only to realize, far too late, that the machine had a life of its own. He was the most powerful man in Europe, yet in the quiet moments before sleep, he was entirely, hopelessly powerless to stop the storm he had helped to gather. As the night deepens, let the image of the lonely emperor fade into the soft, swirling mist of the past. The grand palace grows dark. The ticking clock in the study slows its rhythm, blending with the gentle, rhythmic beating of your own resting heart. The heavy crowns of the world do not matter here. In the peaceful silence of the night, we are all just fragile souls, seeking a warm place in the dark. Close your eyes, let the heavy armor of the day slip from your shoulders, and rest quietly, as the embers of history glow softly in the distance. Imagine the quiet, sinking feeling of watching the shadows stretch across your floorboards, knowing the warmth of the sun is slipping away, and realizing you are entirely alone in the room. Welcome back, my friend. Wrap your blanket a little tighter, settle deeply into wherever you are resting, and let the gentle current of our story carry you once more into the fading twilight of the old world. Tonight, we are going to look softly at a fear that cannot be touched or held, but one that rests heavy on the chest. We are going to explore the quiet, creeping chill of isolation. Picture a beautiful, sturdy house sitting right in the center of a very deep, very old forest. For a long time, the family inside this house felt perfectly safe. They had a warm hearth, they had music, they had the comfort of their own company. But they were always aware of the neighbors who lived on the edges of the woods. To the west, there was a proud, elegant estate, nursing old grievances behind tall iron gates. And to the east, stretching out further than the eye could see, was a vast, mysterious, snow-covered manor. For generations, the people in the middle house slept soundly because they knew the estate to the west and the manor to the east did not speak to one another. There was a quiet comfort in that division. But slowly, imperceptibly, the wind began to change. Imagine you are an elderly clockmaker living in the winding, cobblestone streets of Munich. It is a crisp morning, and the smell of fresh coffee and pipe tobacco fills your small, dusty shop. You sit at your wooden workbench, carefully adjusting the delicate, tiny gears of a pocket watch. Through the frosted glass of your window, you see the paperboy drop the morning gazette. You wipe your hands on your apron, step out into the cool morning air, and unfold the paper. There, written in plain black ink, is a story about a grand banquet held far away in St. Petersburg. You read that French diplomats have traveled across the continent, sipping champagne and exchanging warm, lingering handshakes with Russian officials. To a modern reader, this is just diplomacy. But to the clockmaker, reading the paper in the quiet light of morning, it is a sudden, heavy drop in his stomach. He looks up from the pages, watching the breath of passing horses mingle with the morning fog. He thinks of his 2 young grandsons, asleep in the room upstairs. He knows, with the quiet intuition of a man who has lived a long life, that when the West and the East finally embrace, the middle is caught in a vice. This was the feeling that settled over Germany like a thick, gray blanket. They called it Einkreisung. Encirclement. It was not a loud, dramatic panic. It was a slow, melancholic claustrophobia that slipped beneath the doors and through the window cracks of everyday life. It is the profound human fear of being left out, magnified to the scale of millions of souls. Imagine sitting at a grand, candlelit dinner table. The room is filled with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. But as the evening wears on, you notice the people on your left and the people on your right have leaned behind your chair, whispering to one another in hushed tones, smiling, sharing a secret that you are not allowed to hear. The food on your plate suddenly loses its taste. The room suddenly feels very cold. In the quiet, private diaries of the time, we find the true heartbeat of this fear. There is a deeply moving entry written by the wife of a minor German diplomat in Berlin. She writes of attending a magnificent winter ball. The orchestra was playing a beautiful, sweeping waltz. The chandeliers glowed like captured stars. But as she stood by the heavy velvet curtains, sipping her drink, she watched the French ambassador and the Russian military attaché stand together by the fireplace. She wrote, "They spoke for a very long time. They did not look at us, but I felt as though every word they said was drawing a line around our home." I looked at my husband, standing alone near the music, trying so hard to smile, and I felt a sudden, terrifying urge to take his hand and run away into the dark. I fear the circle is closing. This is how the tightening noose felt. It was not made of ropes or weapons. It was woven from quiet snubs, unreturned letters, and secret agreements made in rooms where Germans were not invited. The people in the cities and the quiet farming villages felt this invisible weight pressing down on them. A mother planting tulip bulbs in her garden would look up at the horizon, wondering if the borders of her country were strong enough to hold back the tide. A schoolteacher, wiping chalk from the board at the end of the day, would look at the map of Europe hanging on the wall. He would trace the vast, overwhelming pink mass of Russia on one side, and the solid blue block of France on the other, feeling entirely swallowed by the sheer size of the world arrayed against his home. When humans are afraid, when they feel cornered and entirely alone, they do not always act out of malice. They act out of a desperate need to breathe. The massive armies that Germany began to build, the endless trains they constructed, the strict, unyielding plans they drew up in the dead of night, these were not the confident strides of a conqueror. They were the frantic, desperate pacing of a trapped animal looking for a way out of a cage. It is fascinating, and deeply heartbreaking, to realize how much of human history is shaped by secrets in the dark. The hushed alliances of the First World War, the quiet handshakes, the invisible ink of diplomacy, they set the stage for a world that would forever rely on the shadows. This unseen world of whispers didn't end when the guns of the Great War finally fell silent. In fact, the unhealed fears of this era only deepened, weaving directly into the espionage and hidden heroism of the next great conflict. If you find yourself captivated by these hidden histories, by the secrets that moved the world while ordinary people slept, I would love to share something very special with you. I have a quiet, welcoming email newsletter where I send out gentle deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past. When you join our little community, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It explores the unbelievable true stories of hidden heroes and secret missions that echoed from the very fears we are talking about tonight. I invite you to join us, like a caring friend offering a lantern in the dark. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As we step back into the quiet streets of the past, the sense of isolation only grows more profound. Despite the encroaching shadows, life had to continue. This is the beautiful, quiet resilience of the human spirit. Even when the world feels as though it is closing in, the baker must still wake up long before dawn to knead the dough. The flour still dusts his hands like fresh snow. He still shapes the loaves with care, placing them into the glowing warmth of the oven, providing a small, comforting slice of normalcy for his neighbors. The letters written between friends across borders took on a delicate, heartbreaking tone. Imagine a young German university student writing to his dearest friend who lives in Paris. They had spent summers together, reading poetry under the shade of old oak trees, dreaming of a future filled with art and light. Now, his pen moves slowly across the parchment. "My dear friend," he writes, "the newspapers say we are enemies now. They say that a line has been drawn in the earth between your home and mine. But when I look up at the moon tonight, I know it is the exact same moon shining down on your window. I refuse to let the darkness in the hearts of kings extinguish the light in ours. Please, promise me you will remember my face, not as a soldier of the empire, but as the boy who shared your bread in the summer." These are the unseen tears of history. The gentle ties of humanity stretching, pulling tight, and fraying under the immense, unfeeling weight of national strategy. In the high offices of Berlin, the maps on the tables seemed to glow with a quiet menace. Every new railroad track built in Russia was reported back to Germany. To the generals, each new track was not a path for trade or travel, it was an arrow pointing directly at their heart. They timed the trains. They calculated how many days it would take for 1,000,000 men to cross the snowy plains and stand at their eastern door. Every new treaty signed in Paris was felt as a physical restriction of their breath. The men who carried the burden of defending the empire stopped sleeping. They paced the halls, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. They were men terrified of failing their people, men who genuinely believed that if they did not find a way to break the ring of steel forming around them, their beloved country, with its music, its poetry, its quiet villages, and its grand cities, would simply be erased from the earth. And so, the noose tightened. Not with a sudden jerk, but with a slow, agonizing pull. The air grew thinner. The world grew quieter. The peaceful illusions of the past decade were slowly stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of a continent holding its breath. But for tonight, you do not need to carry that weight. The worries of those old empires are locked away in the dust of the past. The shadows on your floorboards are just a gentle passing of the evening. Listen to the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breath. Feel the soft warmth of your resting place. The clockmaker has put away his tools. The baker has swept the flour from his floor. The houses are dark, and the world is giving itself over to sleep. Let go of the day, let the quiet of the night wrap softly around you, and drift away into a peaceful, unbroken slumber. Imagine the slow, rhythmic ringing of a heavy hammer striking steel, a lonely, echoing sound that floats out over the dark water and vanishes softly into the thick, white mist. Welcome back, my friend, to the quiet corners of the past. Gather your blankets gently around you, let out a long, slow breath, and allow the heavy worries of your own day to drift away on the turning tide. Tonight, our journey takes us away from the claustrophobic halls and the hushed, velvet rooms of the continent. We are stepping out into the cool, salty air. We are going to look out over the vast, gray expanse of the open ocean, where massive giants slept in the fog, and ordinary men built them with calloused hands and quiet hopes. When we think of the great naval arms race before the First World War, it is so easy to picture nothing but cold numbers on a page. We imagine the lists of tonnage, the thickness of armor plating, and the size of massive cannons. But history is never just steel and mathematics. It is sweat on a brow. It is the pride of a long day's work. It is the quiet fear of a father looking out at the horizon, wondering if the sea will keep his family safe. Picture the sprawling dockyards of northern Germany and the sleepy coastal towns where the air always smells faintly of burning coal and sea spray. The sky is still a bruised, tender purple when an older shipyard worker, let us call him Elias, wakes up for his shift. The floorboards creak softly beneath his boots as he walks to the small kitchen. He pours a cup of hot, chicory coffee, kisses his sleeping wife gently on the forehead, and steps out into the crisp morning fog. As Elias walks to the harbor, the skeletons of massive ships rise up before him, looming like iron cathedrals against the pale morning light. Elias is not a man who dreams of empire or global domination. He does not wish for war. He thinks only of the honest pride of his craftsmanship, the steady wages that keep bread on his family's table, and the quiet dignity of building something strong. To him, and to millions of ordinary citizens, these colossal ships were not symbols of aggression. They were shields. For Germany, a young nation that felt trapped in the center of Europe, the ocean represented the only open door. The sea was their freedom from the invisible noose tightening on land. They believed, with a tragic innocence, that if they could just build a protective wall of magnificent ships, the older empires of the world would finally respect them. They believed that strength would earn them the right to be left in peace. It was a deep, human yearning for safety, translated into rivets, iron, and steam. Now, let us float softly across the chilly, rolling waters of the North Sea. We arrive on the shores of the British Isles, wrapped in their ancient, misty isolation. For centuries, the deep, dark ocean had been their protective moat. The sea was their comforting embrace, keeping the endless conflicts of the continent far from their quiet villages and green hills. Imagine a young British sailor, standing watch on the deck of a great dreadnought in the dead of night. The wind pulls gently at his heavy wool coat. He leans against the cold, damp railing, peering into the swirling fog. Later, in the dim, amber light of his swinging bunk, he dips a pen into an inkwell and writes a letter to his mother back in a small village in Cornwall. He writes to her about the rhythmic rocking of the waves, and how it reminds him of the cradle she used to rock him in as a child. But he also writes about the rumors he hears in the mess hall. He speaks of the new ships being built across the water, shadows moving in the mist. The fear in his heart is so perfectly human. What Elias the shipbuilder views as a protective shield, this young sailor views as a sword creeping slowly toward his front door. This is the profound, heartbreaking tragedy of the ships in the fog. Two nations, looking across the water, building giant steel guardians out of a mutual, silent terror. Every rivet driven into the hull of a ship was an expression of a nation saying, "Please, do not hurt us." But through the distorting haze of the mist, the other side only saw a monster rising from the deep. Yet, the men who sailed these ships were bound by the quiet brotherhood of the sea. There were small, beautiful moments of humanity out there in the freezing waters. A German patrol boat spotting a stranded British fishing vessel with a broken sail. They did not raise their guns. They pulled alongside the shivering fishermen, tossing them a thick rope and passing over 10 cups of steaming tea to warm their freezing hands, before gently towing them back toward the safety of their own waters. They were not enemies in those quiet moments, they were just men who shared a profound respect for the unforgiving ocean. This era of building massive steel giants out of fear transformed the oceans forever. The dreadnoughts of this fragile time laid the foundation for the unimaginable naval warfare that would follow a generation later. When we look back at history, the echoes of these first great ships carried forward into the sweeping, dramatic ocean battles of the Pacific during the Second World War. If you find yourself deeply moved by the incredible history of naval fleets and the stories of the brave souls who navigated those vast, perilous waters, I have something wonderful to share with you. Like a caring friend wanting to bring you closer to the history you love, I highly recommend checking out Amazon for beautiful World War II memorabilia, or settling in to watch the visually stunning movie Midway on Prime. It honors the visual history and the sheer scale of the Pacific theater, showing what those early ships eventually evolved into. Please, To keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us bring our minds gently back to the lapping waves of the early 20th century. The shipyards are quiet now. The great anchors have been dropped, sinking deep, deep down into the soft, silty bottom of the harbor. Imagine the interior of one of these resting giants. Deep inside the steel belly, sheltered from the biting wind, it is warm. The furnaces hum with a low, comforting vibration, like the purr of a giant, sleeping cat. A young German stoker, his face covered in a fine dusting of black coal, sits on an overturned wooden crate. He carefully reaches into his breast pocket and pulls out a small, wrinkled photograph of his sweetheart. He stares at her smiling face in the dim light. He does not care about the grand, sweeping strategies of the admirals in Berlin or London. He does not care about national prestige or naval dominance. He just traces the edge of the photograph with his soot-stained thumb, hoping with all his heart that the thick steel walls around him are strong enough to keep him safe, so he can return to hold her hand when the autumn leaves begin to fall. The paradox of these magnificent ships is that they were built to be peacekeepers. The leaders of both nations held on to a strange, hopeful illusion. They genuinely believed that if they built weapons so terrible, so majestic, and so awe-inspiring, no one would ever dare to strike a match. It was a belief that mountains of iron could somehow prevent the shedding of human tears. But ships in the fog are entirely blind. They cannot see the soft, beating hearts inside the hulls of the vessels passing them in the dark. The British admirals looked through their brass spyglasses and saw a profound threat to their ancient home. The German admirals looked through theirs and saw a cage being slowly dragged across the ocean to lock them in. And in this mutual, quiet blindness, the tension slowly thickened, wrapping around the world like the very mist that blanketed the North Sea. As the night deepens, picture the harbors growing entirely still. The workers have all gone home. Elias is sleeping soundly beside his wife, his rough, calloused hands resting peacefully on the edge of the quilt. Across the water, the young British sailor has finished his letter, folded it carefully into his chest, and closed his eyes to the gentle sway of the hammock. The immense steel ships rock softly in the dark water, bathed in the soft, silver light of the moon. The furnaces are banked to a low, glowing red. The great cannons point silently toward the stars. Tonight, they are not weapons of sorrow. They are just empty machines, resting peacefully on the tide. Let the rhythmic, slow breathing of the ocean wash over you. Listen to the rise and fall of the dark water against the wooden piers. The soft, distant chime of a bell buoy swaying in the current. The world is resting now. The fog is thick and protective, wrapping the anxieties of the past in a soft, white blanket. Let your own mind drift away into the mist, safe and warm, as the gentle tide carries you down into a deep, unbroken sleep. Imagine drawing a long, sweeping line across a piece of paper, entirely unaware of the soft, sleeping lives resting just beneath the ink. Welcome back to our quiet corner of the past. Please, pull your blankets up a little higher, let your head sink deeply into your pillow, and take a slow, gentle breath in. Let the heavy worries of your own day gently wash away, leaving only the soft, distant echoes of our story. Tonight, we are going away from the grand palaces and the misty oceans. We are going to step into a very quiet, very still room, lit only by the warm, amber glow of a single desk lamp. In this room, an old man is leaning over a massive, unfurled map. The house around him is entirely silent. The only sound is the rhythmic, soothing ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, and the faint, dry scratch of a graphite pencil moving slowly across the thick parchment. This old man is a mathematician of human movement. In the history books, he is known by his titles and his aristocratic name, Count von Schlieffen. But tonight, let us just see him as an aging, tired soul, burdened with an impossible puzzle. He is carrying the profound, suffocating fear we spoke of before, the fear of his home being surrounded, the terror of the tightening noose. and because he is a man of logic, a man who believes that the chaotic, frightening world can be tamed by numbers and perfectly drawn lines, he is trying to calculate a way out of the trap. His country, Germany, feels entirely trapped between two giant neighbors. He believes that if a storm comes, they cannot fight in two directions at once. And so, in the lonely, quiet hours of the night, while the rest of the world is dreaming, he designs a massive, intricate dream of his own. It is a plan of staggering, cold perfection. The idea is simple, yet immense. If the terrible day ever arrives, millions of men will move in a grand, sweeping arc, like a giant door swinging open upon a hinge. They will walk through the quiet, neutral fields of Belgium, sweep down through the countryside, and end the conflict in the west before the vast, slow-moving armies of the east can even tie their boots. It is all timed to the very minute. It relies on train schedules, walking speeds, and the sheer, unyielding power of mathematics. But there is a heartbreaking tragedy in this beautiful, flawless logic. It is entirely devoid of human warmth. Look closely at the map beneath his trembling, aged hands. To the old man, the wide, sweeping blue and red arrows are just measurements. They are solutions to a terrifying equation. But let us zoom in, closer and closer, past the graphite lines, down into the reality of the earth itself. Right in the path of that massive, sweeping arrow is a tiny, slumbering village in Belgium. The air there is sweet with the smell of damp earth and blooming clover. In one of the small stone cottages, a mother is gently rocking her infant back to sleep in the quiet hours before dawn. She hums a soft, familiar lullaby, brushing a stray curl from the baby's forehead. Next door, the village baker is already awake, his hands dusted with soft white flour, kneading the dough that will feed his neighbors come morning. In the barn, heavy draft horses shift peacefully in their stalls, their warm breath pluming in the cool air. These are just ordinary, beautiful lives. They know nothing of grand strategies or geopolitical fears. They do not know that an old man in a room hundreds of miles away has just drawn a pencil line directly through their kitchen tables, through their gardens, through their quiet, simple futures. To the map, they do not exist. To the equation, they are merely a measurement of distance. This is the cold dream of the mathematician. It is the belief that a living, breathing world can be perfectly controlled by paper and ink. The very heartbeat of this meticulous plan relied upon the trains. Imagine the grand, echoing railway stations of the time, filled with billowing white steam and the beautiful, rhythmic chugging of iron engines. We so often forget the ordinary hands that kept those great machines moving. Think of a young railway clerk in a small provincial town in Germany. Let us call him Thomas. Thomas is a gentle soul who wears a pair of round spectacles that always seem to slide down his nose. He loves his job with a quiet, profound passion. He loves the heavy, leather-bound ledger books where he records the arrival and departure of every locomotive. He takes immense pride in knowing that the evening train from Munich arrives at exactly 4 minutes past 6. To him, the timetables are not tools of empire, they are a beautiful, comforting symphony of order. Thomas writes letters to his sweetheart, explaining the poetry of the tracks. He writes, "My darling, there is such a wonderful peace in knowing exactly where everything is supposed to be. The trains run on time, the wheels turn perfectly, and the world makes sense." He does not realize that his beloved timetables have been secretly woven into the old man's grand equation. He does not know that the very schedules he guards so carefully are the invisible gears of a massive, unstoppable machine. The plan dictates that, should the order ever be given, 11,000 trains must move in perfect synchronization. 11,000 trains, carrying millions of young boys taken from their farms, their shops, and their schools, hurtling blindly toward the edge of the map. To the old man in the study, it is a triumph of logistics. To the mothers who will stand on the platforms, waving tear-stained handkerchiefs as the steam engines pull their sons away into the mist, it will be the end of their world. When we look at the old, pristine maps from this era, with their elegant calligraphy and neat, sweeping lines, they are so profoundly silent. They look almost peaceful. They do not show the mud. They do not show the terror in a young boy's eyes when the perfect equation breaks down in the rain. They do not show the harsh, unfiltered truth of what happens when the cold, rigid plans of men collide with the fragile, beating hearts of reality. Those raw, uncensored truths are often missing from the history books we read, and they are usually too restricted or sensitive to be shown on normal platforms. But I believe that to truly honor the everyday heroes who lived through these storms, we must be willing to look quietly and respectfully at their genuine reality. If you are someone who wishes to look deeper, I have carefully gathered a collection of unseen, raw images and videos of the world wars in my Gumroad store. It is a digital collection meant for those who want to bridge the gap between the clean, flawless maps and the true, deeply human experience of the past. It is an offering to our quiet community, meant to be viewed with a reflective heart. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us step softly back into the dimly lit study. The years pass, like sand slipping quietly through an hourglass. The old mathematician eventually leaves this world. He passes away in his bed, his mind still trapped in the endless calculations of his dream, his final, whispered words begging those who remain to keep the sweeping right wing of his plan strong. He leaves behind his life's work in a heavy, sealed folder. And the men who inherit this folder are terrified of it. Imagine the new caretaker of the plan, Malka. He is not a cold, unfeeling machine. He is a deeply spiritual, nervous man who reads poetry, paints landscapes, and plays the cello in the quiet hours of the evening to soothe his anxious mind. When he opens the heavy folder and looks at the millions of tiny, calculated steps, he feels a crushing, unbearable weight settle upon his chest. He realizes the terrifying flaw in the perfect dream. He realizes that once the machine is turned on, it cannot be stopped. The timetables are so incredibly tight, the train schedules so meticulously interwoven, that there is no room for a pause. There is no room for diplomacy, no room for a last-minute change of heart, no room for a whispered conversation or a gentle negotiation. If the button is ever pushed, the machine will simply run, pulling the entire continent along with it, down into the dark. This realization haunts his quiet moments. He paces the long, carpeted hallways of the high command late at night. He looks out the tall windows at the sleepy, moonlit streets of Berlin. He sees a lone lamplighter, he sees a stray dog resting on the cobblestones, he sees a world that is so beautiful, so incredibly fragile. And he knows, with a sickening ache in his stomach, that he is shackled to a ghost's equation. He writes in his private journal with a trembling hand, confessing his deepest fears. He writes of the awful burden of wearing a dead man's armor. He knows that humanity is not a mathematical formula. He knows that soldiers will get tired, that the rain will turn the roads to thick, grasping mud, that the heavy draft horses will need rest, and that the frightened people in the path of the arrow will not simply disappear into thin air. Yet, the fear of the tightening noose, the fear of being entirely surrounded, is so great that they feel they have no choice but to place their faith in the cold dream. They bind their fate to the ticking clock in the swinging door, praying that the numbers will somehow save them from the dark. But for now, the door remains closed. Let the image of the map slowly fade from your mind. The sweeping lines of blue and red dissolve into the gentle, swirling mist of the past. The intricate train timetables blur into nothingness. The grandfather clock in the hallway slows its ticking, matching the steady, calming rhythm of your own heart. The old man in the study has put down his pencil. The desk lamp is turned off with a soft, quiet click. The room is swallowed by the peaceful, protective darkness of the night. Out in the quiet villages, the people are safe in their beds. The baker's dough is rising in the warmth of the kitchen. The young railway clerk is dreaming sweetly of his sweetheart, a soft smile resting on his face. The heavy horses are asleep in the sweet-smelling hay. For this moment, in this gentle pause of history, everything is entirely still. Everything is at peace. Allow yourself to sink completely into that stillness. Feel the soft, comforting weight of your blanket. Listen to the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Let the cold calculations of the world melt away, leaving only the warmth of your own quiet room. Rest now, my friend, drift away softly, and surrender to a deep, unbroken sleep. Imagine the scent of dry pine needles baking in the late afternoon sun, and that heavy, breathless silence that settles over a valley just before the sky breaks into a storm. Welcome back, my friend, to our quiet journey through the shadows of the past. Please, draw your blankets up a little closer, let your head sink deeply into the cool softness of your pillow, and take a long, slow breath. Let the frantic pace of your day fall away. Tonight, we are leaving the grand, polished marble halls of Berlin and the misty, ironclad harbors of the north. We are traveling somewhere entirely different. We are going to a place of wild, rugged beauty, where ancient mountains touch the clouds and deep, emerald valleys hold the quiet secrets of generations. We are traveling to the borderlands of the Balkans. To the grand emperors sitting in their velvet chairs far away, this land was simply a tinderbox. It was a problem on a map, a puzzle of shifting borders, a place where the massive, sprawling shadows of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires pressed tightly against one another. But to the people who actually lived there, it was not a chessboard, and it was certainly not a tinderbox. It was simply home. Imagine an old farmer, let us call him Milan, walking slowly up a steep, rocky path just as the morning dew begins to evaporate. His face is deeply lined by decades of summer sun and harsh winter winds. He carries a long, wooden walking stick, worn smooth by the touch of his own rough hands. Before him, a small flock of sheep moves like a soft, white cloud against the vibrant green of the hillside. The only sounds are the rhythmic clinking of the small brass bells around their necks and the gentle, rushing whisper of a distant river below. Milan does not read the newspapers from the distant capitals. He does not care about the grand alliances, the shifting of royal titles, or the strategic fears of aging diplomats. His worries are beautifully, profoundly simple. He worries about the frost coming too early and ruining his small crop of winter wheat. He worries about the wolves that roam the higher peaks in the dark of the moon. He worries about the ache in his knees when the damp weather rolls in. But lately, sitting on a sun-warmed stone and looking out over his valley, he has felt a strange, creeping unease in the air. He notices the small, subtle changes. He sees the young men from his village being called away, returning weeks later in stiff, unfamiliar uniforms, speaking of heavy rifles and new marching orders. He sees the strange, foreign flags being raised over the little stone customs house at the edge of the valley. He watches as men with surveying equipment and crisp leather boots draw imaginary lines across the very fields where his grandfather once taught him to herd the sheep. To the men in Vienna or St. Petersburg, drawing a border is as simple as running a pen across a piece of parchment. But down in the valley, that line is a heavy, physical thing. It cuts through families. It cuts through old friendships. It separates a mother from her daughter, a farmer from his market, a shepherd from his pasture. Think of a mother living in a small, whitewashed cottage near that new, invisible border. She is standing in her garden in the fading light of evening, carefully tying up the heavy, fragrant branches of a tomato plant. Her hands smell of rich soil and green leaves. Through the open window of her kitchen, she can hear her young children laughing as they share a bowl of sweet, dark cherries. She pauses her work and looks up toward the horizon. She has heard the murmurs in the village square. She has listened to the traveling merchants who bring salt and fabric, but who also bring hushed, frightened stories of giant armies gathering just beyond the mountains. She knows that the empires to the north and east are playing a careless, heavy-handed game with her homeland. They treat the Balkans like a dark, dusty room where they can push their furniture around without caring what gets crushed beneath the legs. Later that night, by the flickering, amber light of a solitary tallow candle, she writes a letter to her sister, who lives in a village that is now across the new border. Her handwriting is careful and deliberate. She writes, "My dearest sister, the wild lavender is blooming beautifully this year, covering the hills in purple. We spent the morning making the plum jam, just the way Mother taught us. But my heart is heavy tonight. They have placed new guards at the bridge over the river. They wear strange hats and do not smile when we pass. They tell us that we belong to a different king now, that you and I are no longer part of the same country. But when I walk down to the riverbed, the water still sings the exact same song. The soil still feels the same beneath my bare feet. How can men in distant castles tell the earth who it belongs to? Please, keep the children close, and pray that the giants leave us be." These are the quiet tears of the borderlands. The tragic, beautifully human resilience of people who are trying so desperately to hold onto the gentle rhythms of their lives while the ground beneath them slowly begins to tremble. The grand history books so rarely speak of these people. They write about the archdukes and the generals, the ultimatums and the treaties. But the untold stories of these borderland families, the quiet, everyday heroism of a mother making jam while the world prepares for fire, are the true, beating heart of our past. There is such profound beauty in unearthing these deeply human, uncensored fragments of history that are so often swept aside. If you find a sense of peace in these hidden, personal stories, and if you wish to look deeper into the untold corners of the past, I have created a quiet, welcoming community on our Patreon. It is a gentle harbor for history lovers who want to explore deeper, uncensored historical deep dives, with raw, ad-free podcasts and stories that simply cannot be shared everywhere. It is a place to gather and remember those who history left behind. I would be so honored to have you join us there. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us return, softly, to the valley. The long, golden afternoon is beginning to soften into dusk. The term tinderbox is such a frightening word, but it perfectly captures the heavy, breathless feeling of that long, fateful summer. A tinderbox is not made of explosions or loud noises. It is made of dry, fragile things. It is made of exhaustion, of whispered fears, of people who have been pushed and pulled by foreign rulers for so long that their patience is worn as thin as old parchment. The people of the Balkans did not want a war that would engulf the world. They simply wanted to breathe. They wanted the heavy, suffocating boots of the surrounding empires to step off their necks. They wanted to speak their own languages, to sing their own ancient songs without looking over their shoulders, to govern their own valleys without asking permission from a capital 1,000 miles away. But the empires were blind to the delicate humanity of the region. To them, the Balkans were just a place to test their strength, a place to block their rivals, a place to strike a match to see how brightly the flame would burn. They did not realize that the wood they were playing with was dry, and tired, and ready to catch. As the sun sets, casting long, velvet shadows across the rugged peaks, the village begins to settle into the evening. The bells on Milan's sheep grow silent as the flock huddles together in the warmth of the stone fold. The farmer leans on his wooden gate, smoking a pipe, watching the smoke curl lazily up into the cooling air. In the cottages below, the hearth fires are lit. You can hear the soft, mournful notes of a wooden flute drifting through the twilight, a melody that speaks of old sorrows and quiet endurances. A grandmother sits by the fire, knitting a thick woolen blanket, her hands moving with the steady, comforting rhythm of a lifetime of labor. She tells a story to the children at her feet, an old folk tale about a little bird that outsmarts a great, clumsy bear. It is a story of hope, a gentle reminder that the small and the fragile can survive the heavy footsteps of the giants. This is the everyday heroism that kept the world turning. The act of knitting a blanket, of playing a flute, of putting children to bed with a kiss on the forehead, even when the horizon is dark with gathering clouds. It is the profound courage of ordinary people choosing to live beautifully in the shadow of the unknown. Tonight, let us wrap ourselves in that same quiet courage. You do not need to carry the weight of the empires, or the worries of the tinderbox. Those old fears belong to the dust and the memory of the mountains. Here, in your space, the air is cool and peaceful. The only sound is the steady, calming rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling like the gentle tide of the sleeping river. Let the shadows of the valley blend into the soft darkness of your room. The farmer is resting. The mother is sleeping. The world has grown completely, perfectly still. Close your eyes, let go of the day, and drift softly down into a warm, unbroken, and beautiful slumber. Imagine the golden warmth of a summer morning, the scent of crushed roses drifting on a gentle breeze, and the quiet, tragic beauty of a love story riding unknowingly into the shadows. Welcome back, my friend. Let the heavy burdens of your day slip quietly from your shoulders. Pull your blankets up a little closer, take a slow, deep breath, and let the soft, calming current of the past carry you away. Tonight, we are going to walk down a sunlit street in a beautiful, ancient city. We are going to look past the grand, sweeping declarations of war, past the maps and the politics, and we are going to witness a profoundly human moment. We are going to ride in a carriage through the old, winding streets of Sarajevo. When the world looks back at this day, history books often paint it in harsh, dramatic colors. They speak of an assassination that ignited the globe. But to truly understand the sorrow of this moment, we must not look at the leaders of empires. We must look at a husband, a wife, and a very frightened young boy. Imagine Archduke Franz Ferdinand, a man who carried the heavy, suffocating expectations of a massive empire on his shoulders. The court in Vienna was a cold, rigid place, obsessed with ancient rules and bloodlines. And yet, this stern, mustachioed man possessed a quiet, fiercely tender heart. He was completely, hopelessly in love with a woman named Sophie. Sophie was warm, intelligent, and kind. But to the unforgiving eyes of the royal court, she was not of high enough birth to marry a future emperor. For years, the courtiers whispered cruel things. They treated her like a shadow. At grand banquets, she was forced to walk far behind him, separated by dozens of lesser nobles. She was never allowed to sit beside him in the royal carriage. For 14 years, they endured these quiet, daily humiliations. But every night, behind the heavy wooden doors of their private rooms, he would hold her hand, looking into her eyes with a profound, protective devotion, reminding her that she was the only queen of his heart. This trip to Sarajevo was supposed to be a rare, beautiful gift. Because he was traveling as a military commander rather than in his royal capacity, the suffocating rules of the court did not apply. For the first time in their long marriage, Sophie could sit right beside him in an open carriage, for all the world to see. Picture her on that bright summer morning. She is wearing a flowing white dress, holding a delicate lace parasol to shield her eyes from the sun. Franz sits beside her, wearing his grand uniform, a magnificent helmet adorned with soft green feathers resting on his head. But if you look closely at his face, he is not glowing with the pride of a conqueror. He is glowing with the quiet, swelling pride of a husband who finally gets to share the sunlight with the woman he loves. Before they left for the city, Sophie had written a quick, gentle letter to their children waiting back home. She wrote about how beautiful the mountains looked from the train window, and promised she would be home soon to embrace them. They were simply parents, looking forward to returning to the quiet sanctuary of their family. But as their carriage rolls slowly along the riverbank, the wheels humming softly against the cobblestones, there is another story waiting in the crowd. Stand with me now, in the shade of a small cafe, among the cheering people lining the street. Among the faces, there is a young teenager named Gavrilo. When we hear his name in the echoes of history, he is often painted as a cold, calculating monster. But standing here, on this warm summer morning, he is just a boy. A frail, sickly teenager who suffers from tuberculosis, a boy whose chest aches when he breathes. He is not a hardened soldier. He is a boy who writes bad poetry in the margins of his schoolbooks. He is a boy who is desperately hungry for meaning, looking for a way to matter in a world that feels so impossibly large and uncaring. He has been swept up in the passionate, overwhelming tide of revolutionary ideas, convinced by older men that a single, grand act could free his people from the heavy grip of the empire. But ideas are light, and reality is terribly heavy. As he stands in the crowd, the small pistol hidden in his coat pocket feels like it is made of lead. He is terrified. His hands are trembling so fiercely he has to press them against his sides to keep them still. Sweat beads on his forehead. He is caught in a sweeping storm of adult ideologies, a fragile leaf spinning in a hurricane, completely unaware that he is about to change the shape of the world forever. It takes an immense, meticulous effort to piece together these quiet, tragic human moments. To sweep away the dust of a century, to look past the grand titles, and to find the trembling hands of a frightened boy, or the protective, devoted smile of a husband finally sitting beside his wife. It is a slow, deeply personal labor of love to preserve the fragile humanity of the past. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys, and if you would like to support the deep research and quiet dedication it takes to keep this history alive, I invite you to leave a small tip on our Ko-Fi page. It is just a gentle way to help me continue unearthing these deeply human stories for you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us return to that sun-drenched street in Sarajevo. The air is warm, the crowd is cheering, and the open carriage moves slowly forward. Earlier in the morning, there had already been a frightening moment. Another young man in the crowd had thrown a small explosive toward the carriage. It had bounced off the folded roof and exploded behind them, injuring some of the guards and the people in the crowd. Franz and Sophie were unharmed, but the golden morning had suddenly grown very dark. Franz was deeply shaken, not for himself, but for Sophie. He had begged her to stay behind at the town hall, to remain entirely safe while he finished his duties. But Sophie, with the quiet, unyielding courage of a woman deeply in love, had refused. She looked at him softly, her voice steady and calm, and told him that she would not leave his side. Wherever he went, she would go. They decided to change their plans. They would go to the hospital to check on the wounded. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a simple wish to care for those who had been hurt. But in the confusion of the changed plans, a message was not delivered. As the carriage rolled down the street, the driver, entirely unaware of the new route, took a fateful right turn onto a narrow side street. Imagine the slow, agonizing crawl of time in this very moment. The governor, sitting in the front, realizes the mistake. He calls out to the driver, his voice sharp but lost in the noise of the crowd. "Stop! We are going the wrong way. We must go back." The driver pulls gently on the reins. The heavy horses slow to a halt. The carriage stops directly in front of a small delicatessen. And standing right there, just a few feet away, having stepped out of the cafe after giving up entirely on his terrible mission, is Gavrilo. The boy looks up. The carriage is perfectly still. The Archduke and his wife are sitting right in front of him. It is a moment of impossible, tragic coincidence. For a few seconds, the world simply stops breathing. Gavrilo is paralyzed. His heart is hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He sees Franz Ferdinand, the symbol of everything he has been taught to hate. But he also sees Sophie. He sees a woman in a white dress, a mother who has promised to return to her children. He closes his eyes. He turns his head away, unable to look at the human beings before him. His trembling hand reaches into his coat. There is no grand, dramatic explosion. There are just two sharp, terrible cracks, like dry branches snapping in a quiet forest. The crowd gasps. A flock of pigeons scatters from the rooftops, their wings fluttering against the blue sky. In the carriage, everything seems strangely still. Franz Ferdinand sits entirely upright. Sophie's lace parasol falls gently from her hand. For a fleeting moment, the driver thinks the shots have missed. But then, Sophie slowly slumps forward, her head coming to rest upon her husband's knees. Franz looks down at the love of his life. The green feathers on his helmet tremble. He does not cry out in anger. He does not curse the boy standing on the pavement. All he sees is his wife. He leans over her, his voice a desperate, fading whisper. Sophie. Sophie, please don't die. Stay alive for our children. It is not the cry of an archduke. It is the agonizing, heartbreaking plea of a father, of a husband, watching his entire world slip away. His own strength begins to fade, his breathing growing shallow, but his only thought, his final, desperate wish, is for her. On the pavement, the young boy is tackled to the ground. The pistol falls from his trembling fingers, clattering softly against the stone. He is weeping. He did not want to hurt the woman. In his naive, tragic mind, he thought he was striking a blow against an empire, not against a mother and a father. As he is pulled away into the shadows of a prison where he will eventually fade away entirely, the full, crushing weight of reality descends upon him. The carriage quickly turns around, the horses galloping toward the governor's residence, but it is too late. The golden morning has ended. The love story that endured 14 years of silent insults and cold halls has come to a tragic, quiet close in the back of a motorcar. It is so important to remember them like this. Not as a spark that ignited a global fire, but as two people who simply wanted to ride side by side in the sunlight. And to remember the boy not as a mastermind, but as a frightened teenager who closed his eyes because he could not bear to look at what he was doing. History is a heavy tapestry, woven from millions of these fragile, heartbreaking moments. When we pull back the curtain of dates and numbers, we find that the past is entirely made up of people just like us. People who love, people who fear, people who simply want to go home to their children. As the story of Sarajevo softly fades into the distance, let the quiet of your own room gently surround you. The noise of the crowd is gone. The sun has set on that old, ancient city, wrapping the cobblestones in a deep, peaceful blue. You are safe here, in this quiet moment. The struggles of the past are resting. The heavy crowns and the frightened boys have all gone to sleep. Let out a long, slow breath, let the tension release from your chest, and let the gentle darkness wrap you in its comforting embrace. Rest your eyes, drift away on the quiet tide of the night, and sleep beautifully, knowing the world is perfectly still. Imagine the crushing weight of a single, fragile piece of paper, holding a message so heavy that it forces an old, powerful man to close his eyes and gently weep in the dark. Welcome back, my friend, to the quiet, hidden corners of the past. Please, pull your blankets up a little higher, let your head sink deeply into your pillow, and take a slow, gentle breath in, letting it out with a soft sigh. Let the frantic pace and the heavy worries of your own day melt away, leaving only the soft, distant echoes of our story. Tonight, we are leaving the sunlit streets of Sarajevo, and we are traveling north, through the gathering dusk, to a city wrapped in an uneasy, breathless silence. We are stepping into the grand, hushed halls of the Chancellery in Berlin. It is late in the evening. The air in these vast rooms is thick with the scent of old leather bindings, beeswax polish, and the faint, sweet smell of rain against the tall window panes. The heavy velvet curtains have been drawn shut, closing out the world. The only sound is the rhythmic, unhurried ticking of a beautiful mahogany grandfather clock standing in the corner, marking the gentle passage of a time that is about to change forever. History so often focuses on the loud declarations, the marching boots, and the thunder of cannons. But the true tragedies of the world almost always begin in entirely silent rooms, with a single, trembling hand. Imagine an aging statesman sitting behind a massive, dark oak desk. The only light in the room comes from a small, amber-glass reading lamp, casting long, soft shadows across the walls. He is a man who has spent his entire life carefully balancing on a fragile tightrope, trying to keep his deeply anxious nation safe in a world that felt as though it was closing in around them. He looks exhausted. The deep lines etched into his face are pathways of long, sleepless nights and quiet, unending worries. A heavy wooden door opens, very softly. A young aide steps into the dim light. His face is entirely pale. He does not speak a word, he simply walks across the thick woolen carpet and places a small, folded piece of yellow paper on the center of the desk. Then, with a gentle bow, he retreats into the shadows, leaving the old man completely alone. The statesman reaches out. His fingers, spotted with age, tremble just slightly as he unfolds the paper. It is a telegram from the south. It carries the terrible, heartbreaking news of the carriage ride we spoke of last time. It speaks of the Archduke, and of Sophie, and of the sudden, violent end to their golden morning. As he reads the typed, unfeeling letters, the old man does not think of geopolitical strategy. He does not immediately think of the armies massing on the borders, or the ships resting in the fog. He thinks of the sheer, profound fragility of human life. He thinks of a friend he had dined with, a man who had laughed and spoken warmly of his children, now gone in the blink of an eye. The statesman takes off his wire-rimmed spectacles and sets them gently on the desk. He covers his face with his worn, tired hands, and in the absolute stillness of the grand room, he begins to weep. These are not the tears of a monster. They are the tears of a deeply frightened, overwhelmed human being. He weeps because he knows exactly what this small piece of yellow paper means. He knows that the delicate, beautiful web of peace he and his colleagues had tried so desperately to hold together has just violently snapped. He knows that the surrounding empires will now stand up, brushing off their armor, and that the invisible noose he has feared for so long is about to pull tight. He is crying for his country, for the young boys sleeping peacefully in their beds, and for the beautiful, quiet world that is slipping through his fingers like dry sand. Far beneath this grand office, down in the cool, dimly lit basement of the government buildings, there is another quiet human story unfolding. Here, in a room filled with the smell of ozone and machine oil, a young telegraph operator named Johannes sits at his station. Johannes is a gentle, quiet man who loves poetry and tends to a beautiful little flower box on his windowsill at home. He wears a heavy woolen sweater knit by his mother, and his fingers are permanently stained with dark blue ink. For hours, he has been listening to the rhythmic, metallic tap-tap-tap of the brass telegraph machine. It is a language of ghosts, invisible words traveling through miles of copper wire in the dark. When the message from Sarajevo first came through the machine, Johannes was the one who translated it. Imagine the profound dissonance in his heart. He sits there, carefully writing down the words that will set the world on fire, but all he can think about is his own small, beautiful life. He thinks of his wife, asleep in their small apartment across the city, her hair fanned out across the pillow. He thinks of the small vegetable garden he planted behind their building, and how he had promised to help his neighbor fix a broken wooden fence on Sunday. He looks at his ink-stained hands resting on the cold brass of the machine. He realizes, with a slow, sinking ache in his chest, that the world of grand politics and the quiet world of ordinary people have just collided. The shadows of the empires have reached down into his basement, into his garden, and into his home. He carefully folds a copy of the message, places it in a wooden tray, and then simply closes his eyes, whispering a soft, silent prayer for the peaceful days he fears will never return. It is so deeply moving to realize how much of human history hinges on these unseen, silent moments. The tears shed behind locked doors, the secret messages tapping through wires in the dead of night, the hushed conversations of terrified diplomats trying desperately to find a way out of the dark. This hidden world of secret cables and whispered diplomacy did not end when the Great War finally came. In fact, these quiet, desperate operations in the shadows laid the very foundation for the espionage and the hidden heroes of the next generation. If you find yourself captivated by the secret histories that move the world while ordinary people sleep, I would love to invite you to join our quiet community. I have a gentle, welcoming email newsletter where I share stories of the unseen past. When you join, I will send you a free copy of my ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It is filled with the forgotten facts and hidden heroism that echoed directly from the dimly lit rooms we are sitting in tonight. Make it yours, like a gift from a caring friend. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us return now to the quiet, heavy air of the Chancellery. The statesman slowly lowers his hands. He dries his eyes with a white cotton handkerchief. The tears have stopped, but the profound, quiet melancholy remains. He pushes his chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor, and walks over to the tall, sweeping window. He pulls back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. Outside, the city of Berlin is completely, beautifully asleep. The street lamps cast a warm, golden glow across the wet cobblestones. A light mist has begun to fall, wrapping the trees of the Tiergarten in a soft, silvery haze. Down on the street, a solitary policeman is walking his beat, his footsteps echoing faintly in the damp air. In a bakery across the square, a warm, inviting light spills from the window as the baker begins to knead the dough for the morning bread, entirely unaware of the storm gathering in the room above him. The statesman watches the baker. He watches the policeman. He feels an overwhelming surge of protective love for these ordinary people. He wishes he could step out of his grand, suffocating office, walk down into the street, and simply buy a loaf of warm bread. He wishes he could freeze this exact moment in time, to hold the world perfectly still, so that the sun would never have to rise on the terrible decisions waiting for him in the morning. But time is the one thing no empire can conquer. The grandfather clock in the corner chimes, a deep, resonant sound that vibrates through the floorboards. It is a reminder that the gears of the world are turning, slowly and inevitably. The trap that Germany has feared for so long, the tightening circle of steel, is now moving toward them. The tearful realization in this room is not one of a predator preparing to strike. It is the agonizing realization of a cornered man who feels he has no choice but to push back against the walls before they crush him entirely. The old man knows that letters will have to be written. Telegrams will have to be sent. The great, sleeping armies will have to be gently, terribly awakened. But for just a few more hours, he allows himself to stand in the quiet dark, mourning the end of the long, beautiful summer of peace. As we leave the statesman at his window, let the image of the dim, amber-lit room slowly fade from your mind. Let the heavy, wood-paneled walls dissolve into the soft, swirling mist of the night. The worries of the Chancellery are not your worries. The heavy burdens of those old, frightened men have long since turned to dust and memory. They are locked safely away in the past, unable to reach you here. In your room, there is only peace. The air is cool and calm. The only sound is the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing, rising and falling like the quiet tide of a sleeping ocean. Listen to the stillness of the night. Feel the comforting weight of your blankets wrapping around you, keeping you entirely safe and warm. Johannes the clerk has gone home to his garden. The baker has finished his bread. The old statesman has finally closed his eyes. The world has grown perfectly, wonderfully quiet. Let go of the day, release the last bit of tension from your shoulders, and drift softly, peacefully, into a deep and unbroken sleep. Imagine holding out your hand to steady a stumbling friend in the dark, entirely unaware that their falling weight is about to pull you gently, inevitably, over the edge. Welcome back, my friend. Come in from the cold, let the heavy doors of the day close softly behind you, and settle deep into your resting place. Pull your blankets up around your shoulders, take a long, slow breath in, and let it out with a quiet sigh. Tonight, we are going to return to the hushed, velvet-draped rooms of the old world. We are going to look softly at a moment of profound, tragic loyalty. When we read the history of this fragile time, we often come across a phrase that sounds so cold and transactional, the blank check. It sounds like a term used by wealthy bankers in a boardroom, calculating profits and losses. But in the quiet, desperate summer of that year, it was not a financial term at all. It was an emotional promise. It was the tragic, deeply human act of making a vow to an old friend when you are both entirely terrified of the dark. Picture a quiet, elegantly furnished office in Berlin. It is early July. The windows are open just a crack, letting in the sweet, cooling breeze of the evening. The faint sound of a distant horse-drawn carriage clatters softly over the cobblestones. Inside the room, two men are sitting in heavy leather armchairs, a small wooden table between them. On the table rests a silver tray with two delicate porcelain teacups, untouched, the tea growing cold. One man represents the vast, nervous empire of Germany. The other is an aging ambassador from Austria, a man whose eyes are red-rimmed and heavy with grief. To understand the quiet tragedy of this room, we must understand the profound, aching loneliness of Germany at this moment. For years, as we have seen, the leaders of Germany had watched the world turn its back on them. They had watched the invisible noose tighten as France and Russia joined hands across the map. In the vast, sprawling forest of Europe, Germany felt they had only one true friend left. Only one neighbor who had not turned away. And now, that friend was bleeding. Austria had just lost its future in the sunlit streets of Sarajevo. They were an old, crumbling empire, deeply wounded, deeply humiliated, and terrified that if they did not stand tall, they would simply be torn apart by the shifting winds of the world. Imagine you are standing in a crowded, unfriendly room. Everyone is whispering about you, looking at you with cold eyes. You have only one friend standing by your side. Suddenly, someone strikes your friend. If you turn away, if you do not defend them, you will be left completely and entirely alone. This is the deeply human fear that drove the pen across the paper. Let us look at a young diplomatic clerk standing quietly in the shadows of this room. Let us call him Leopold. Leopold is a kind, unassuming young man. He wears a meticulously pressed suit and a pair of round spectacles that catch the soft, amber light of the desk lamp. He holds a smooth leather satchel in his hands. Leopold loves the quiet beauty of his city. He loves the way the baker on his corner always saves him a warm pretzel on Tuesday mornings. He loves reading poetry to his young wife in the evenings, while she brushes her hair by the vanity mirror. He stands in the corner of this grand office, listening to the hushed, strained voices of the older men. He hears the Austrian ambassador speak of sorrow and the need for justice. He hears the German chancellor speak with a voice that is trying to sound strong, but carries a faint, unmistakable tremor of isolation. The chancellor turns to his desk. He takes a piece of heavy, cream-colored parchment. He dips a fountain pen into a glass inkwell. The scratch of the metal nib against the paper is the loudest sound in the room. He writes a promise. It is not a detailed military strategy. It is not a map of conquest. It is simply a promise that says, whatever you feel you must do to heal your wound, we will stand behind you. We will not abandon you. This is the blank check of ruin. It was a promise made out of a desperate, suffocating need to hold on to their last remaining ally. It was a vow of unconditional loyalty, handed over in a quiet room, completely blind to the terrible fire it would soon ignite. Leopold watches as the chancellor folds the heavy paper. He watches as a stick of red sealing wax is held over the small flame of a candle. The wax melts, dripping softly onto the fold like a single, heavy teardrop. The chancellor presses his brass seal into the warm wax. He hands the envelope to the Austrian ambassador. There is no triumphant music playing. There are no cheering crowds. There is only the heavy, breathless silence of a room where a line has just been crossed. Leopold looks at the sealed letter, and a strange, cold shiver passes over his skin. He does not know the future, but he senses the immense, crushing weight resting inside that delicate paper envelope. These quiet alliances, these solemn promises made in the glow of candlelight, tied the fates of millions together like heavy iron chains. It was a tragic domino effect, born of loyalty and fear. And the web of alliances woven in these old European rooms set a devastating precedent for the century to come. The idea that nations must bind themselves into massive, unyielding pacts did not end with the First World War. It spilled over, transforming into the grand, sprawling alliances of the Second World War, reaching far beyond the cobblestone streets of Europe to eventually engulf the vast, deep waters of the Pacific in the next generation. If you find yourself captivated by the incredible, global sweep of these histories and how the dominoes of the past led to the grand theaters of the Second World War, I would love to share a recommendation with you. As a caring friend who wants to help you immerse yourself in the stories you love, I highly suggest checking out Amazon for beautiful WWII memorabilia, or perhaps settling in to watch the visually stunning movie Midway on Prime. It is a powerful way to honor the bravery and the unbelievable scale of the Pacific conflict, a conflict born from the very alliances we are exploring tonight. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us step softly back into the warm Berlin night. The Austrian ambassador has left the office. He walks down the grand, sweeping marble staircase, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. He holds the envelope tightly against his chest, as if the paper itself might offer him warmth. He steps into a waiting carriage, the heavy wooden door closing with a soft click, and the horses begin their steady, rhythmic trot toward the train station. The promise is now moving through the dark. Upstairs, the Chancellor is entirely alone. He walks over to the open window and looks out over the city. Berlin is so peaceful. He can see the distant, glowing dials of the city clocks. He knows what he has done. He has tied the massive, breathing life of his country to the fragile, unpredictable anger of a grieving friend. He closes his eyes and leans his forehead against the cool glass of the windowpane, whispering a quiet prayer into the empty room, hoping desperately that the storm will pass them by. But out in the quiet streets, ordinary life continues, beautifully oblivious to the promises made by weary men in high towers. Imagine a small, cozy apartment just a few streets away. A mother is sitting by the hearth. The fire has burned down to a gentle, glowing orange. She has a wooden sewing box resting on her lap. In her hands is her eldest son's winter coat. It is a deep, sturdy blue wool, worn soft at the elbows. One of the brass buttons has come loose, and she is carefully, lovingly sewing it back on. She threads the needle, her eyes squinting gently in the dim light. She pulls the thread through the heavy fabric, a rhythmic, soothing motion. She is thinking about her boy. He is upstairs, fast asleep, dreaming of the girl he intends to marry in the spring. The mother smooths the fabric with her hand, a simple, quiet gesture of love and protection. She wants him to be warm when the autumn winds arrive. She does not know about the carriage riding through the dark toward the train station. She does not know about the letter sealed with red wax. She does not know that the desperate loyalty of an old statesman has just guaranteed that her boy will not be wearing this coat to his wedding. He will be wearing a completely different uniform, stepping out into a world forever changed. This is the profound, quiet tragedy of the blank check. It was a paper signed in the name of safety, in the name of friendship, that would ultimately ask the mothers of the empire to pay the unbearable price. But in this fragile moment, the price has not yet been asked. The night is still young, and the world is still at peace. Let the image of the grand office slowly dissolve into the mist. The Chancellor turns away from the window, turning off the amber lamp. The room fades into a soft, protective darkness. The carriage carrying the promise disappears down the long, tree-lined avenue, swallowed entirely by the shadows of the night. In her cozy room, the mother finishes sewing the button. She bites the end of the thread, ties a small, neat knot, and folds the heavy wool coat over the back of a wooden chair. She blows out her candle, letting the soft light of the moon spill across the floorboards. She walks quietly up the stairs, peeks into her son's room to hear the steady, calming rhythm of his breathing, and then goes to her own bed. The world is resting. The heavy choices of the past are locked away in history. They cannot reach you here. In your room, the air is still and cool. Your blankets are a safe, warm harbor against the night. Listen to the quiet rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling, a gentle, peaceful tide. Let your mind drift away from the letters, the empires, and the fears of the old world. Surrender to the quiet of the night. Let your shoulders completely relax, let your thoughts grow soft and hazy, and drift gently down into a deep, beautiful, and unbroken sleep. Imagine the soft, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch resting on a wooden desk, a sound that usually brings comfort, but tonight measures the final, fading heartbeats of the old world. Welcome back, my friend. Let the heavy door of your day close softly behind you, shutting out the noise and the rush of the world. Draw your blankets a little closer, let your head sink deeply into the cool, welcoming softness of your pillow, and take a long, slow breath in. Release it with a gentle sigh. Tonight, we are stepping into the quietest, yet most agonizing moments of our story. We are traveling into the deep, breathless nights of late summer, where the air is thick and still, and the world is waiting for a storm it cannot see. We are going to visit the rooms where the clock simply could not stop. In the history books, this time is often called a crisis. It is written as a flurry of official demands, urgent meetings, and sweeping political maneuvers. But to truly understand the tragedy of these nights, we must step away from the grand tables of the emperors. We must go down into the quiet, dimly lit rooms where the actual machinery of the world was operated by exhausted, ordinary hands. Picture a telegraph office in the heart of Berlin. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. The city above is draped in a heavy, peaceful slumber. The streets are empty, bathed in the soft, silver glow of the gas lamps. But down here, in a room smelling faintly of ozone, warm brass, and bitter coffee, there is no peace. Sit quietly beside a young telegraph operator named Arthur. His white cotton shirt is unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal hands stained with dark blue ink. Arthur is a gentle man. On his days off, he likes to take his wife to the parks on the edge of the city, sitting under the willow trees and feeding the swans. He is not a soldier, nor a politician. He is just a messenger. But tonight, his hands are trembling. For days, Arthur has been sitting at his wooden desk, listening to the sharp, metallic clicks of the brass telegraph key. Usually, he transmits the gentle commerce of the empire, cargo shipments, weather reports, perhaps a quick, joyful message from a father to a son. But tonight, the messages coming through the wires are different. They are dense. They are frantic. They are filled with a quiet, creeping terror. He presses his fingers to his temples, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He translates the rapid clicks into words on a piece of paper. He realizes, with a sickening drop in his stomach, what he is typing. He is typing the orders of mobilization. To a modern ear, the word mobilization sounds like men simply gathering their coats and walking to a camp. But in the world of these old empires, mobilization was a colossal, perfectly timed machine. Remember the mathematician's cold dream, the flawless, intricate train schedules drawn up in the quiet hours of the night? That dream was now waking up. Once the order was given, thousands upon thousands of train engines had to have their fires lit. The railway switches had to be locked. The paths had to be cleared. The machine was so massive, and its timing so exquisitely tight, that it did not have brakes. If a single leader changed his mind, if an emperor suddenly wept and begged for the trains to stop, they could not. To stop the trains meant a catastrophic collision of men and steel, leaving the entire nation paralyzed and completely defenseless. Arthur knows this. He grew up the son of a railway worker. He knows that once he hands this piece of paper to the courier waiting in the shadows, a gear will turn that can never be reversed. A tear slips down his cheek, catching the amber light of his desk lamp, and splashes softly onto the wooden desk. He wipes his face with the back of his ink-stained hand. He wants to reach into the wire and pull the words back. He wants to hold the brass key completely still. But the clicks keep coming, relentlessly, carrying the weight of the iron dice that have just been rolled. This is the agonizing tragedy of the clocks that could not stop. The men at the very top of the empires, the ones who had blustered and threatened and postured, suddenly realized they were no longer in control. They had built a machine of such overwhelming logic and rigid schedules that it had stripped them of their own free will. Imagine an old general standing in the high command, looking at a massive clock on the wall. He receives a message that perhaps, just perhaps, diplomacy might work. Perhaps the rival empires can talk. He picks up the telephone, his voice cracking with a desperate, newfound hope, and asks his logistics commander if they can halt the march to the borders. The silence on the other end of the line is the most heartbreaking sound in the world. The reply is a soft, defeated whisper. No. The trains are already moving. If we stop them now, we are entirely ruined. Strong, proud men sat in their chairs and buried their faces in their hands, weeping silently in the dark. They had trapped themselves. The fear of encirclement, the desperate need for a perfect defense, had created a monster that devoured their choices. The clocks simply ticked forward, cold and indifferent to the beating hearts of the men who owned them. The terrifying, unstoppable machinery of mobilization turned paper plans into harsh, unavoidable truths. It transformed the quiet villages and peaceful fields into a landscape of conflict that would forever alter the human spirit. These raw, unfiltered realities of what happens when the unstoppable machine of war is unleashed are profound, but they are often too harsh, too uncensored to be shown on modern platforms. Yet, to truly honor the gravity of this history and the everyday heroism of those swept up in it, we must be willing to look at it honestly. If you are someone who wishes to see the true, unpolished face of this era, I have created a space for our quiet community on my Gumroad store. There, I offer a digital collection of unseen, raw media, images and videos of global conflicts that show the reality of the war machine in its truest form. It is a deeply moving experience, meant for those who want to reach beyond the clean maps and political dates. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us step softly away from the tears of the high command and travel out to a small, sleepy railway station on the edge of the countryside. The station master, an elderly man with a thick white mustache and a kind smile, is making his morning rounds. The eastern sky is just beginning to blush with the soft, tender pink of dawn. The air is cool and smells of dew-soaked grass. He carries a small brass lantern, though he no longer needs it. He walks into his small office to check the daily schedule. He expects to see the usual morning passenger train, the one that carries the farmers to the city market with their baskets of fresh apples and warm bread. He expects to see the afternoon post train. Instead, a courier arrives on a breathless, sweating horse, handing the old man a heavy ledger bound in red leather. The station master opens the book. The peaceful, comforting routine of his entire life has been crossed out with thick, black ink. In its place are pages and pages of military designations, coal requirements, and exact-to-the-minute passing times for trains he has never seen. He steps out onto the wooden platform. The wooden boards creak softly under his boots. He looks down the long, silver tracks stretching away into the morning mist. He loves these tracks. He has watched children grow up, leaving on these tracks for university, and returning on these tracks to be married. They have always been pathways of life, of connection, of gentle human journeys. Now, he listens. Far away, Beyond the rolling green hills, he hears it. A low, rhythmic rumble. The sound of a massive, heavy iron engine pushing itself to the absolute limit. And then another. And another. The ground beneath his boots begins to vibrate with a quiet, menacing hum. He takes off his cap and holds it against his chest. He looks up at the sky, the beautiful, clear blue sky of a summer morning, and he knows that the world he loved has just ended. The trains are coming, and there is absolutely nothing anyone can do to turn them back. Back in Berlin, the young telegraph operator, Arthur, finally finishes his shift. The sun is up now. He walks out of the heavy stone building and steps onto the pavement. The city is waking up. A street sweeper is calmly brushing the cobblestones. A milk cart clatters by, the glass bottles chiming together like a gentle wind chime. A stray dog sleeps peacefully in a patch of warm sunlight. It is entirely surreal. To look at the street, nothing has changed. The world looks so beautifully, perfectly normal. But Arthur knows the secret. He knows that the invisible wires strung above the rooftops have already spoken the words of ruin. He knows the clocks have passed the point of no return. He walks slowly toward his home, his shoulders slumped, carrying the heavy, silent grief of a man who has just watched a tragedy unfold in the language of clicks and pauses. He will go home. He will kiss his wife while she sleeps. He will look at her peaceful face, and he will try to commit every detail of this quiet, safe morning to his memory, knowing that tomorrow, the beautiful illusion will finally shatter. But for you, tonight, the illusion does not need to shatter. The unstoppable trains belong to the past. The tragic ticking of those old clocks is locked away in history, buried beneath the dust of a century. In your room, time is entirely your own. It is soft, it is patient, and it is kind. Listen to the steady, rhythmic beating of your own heart. It is the only clock that matters right now, and its pace is slow, calm, and deeply peaceful. Feel the heavy comfort of your blankets. Notice how the darkness of the room holds you, keeping you entirely safe from the worries of the world outside. The operators have gone home. The station master is resting. The heavy gears of the day have stopped turning. Let out one final, gentle breath. Let your thoughts drift away on the mist of the morning tracks, dissolving into nothingness. Rest now, my friend. Sink deeply into the quiet, and let a beautiful, unbroken sleep wash over you. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast, dark canyon, holding a single, fragile thread, desperately hoping the person on the other side catches it before you both fall into the dark. Welcome back, my friend, to the quiet, hidden corners of our history. Please, let the heavy doors of the world close softly behind you. Draw your blankets up a little higher, let your head sink deeply into the cool, welcoming softness of your pillow, and take a long, slow breath in. Release it with a gentle sigh. Tonight, we are stepping away from the massive, unstoppable trains and the deafening noise of the gathering armies. We are going to look into the soft, flickering light of a private study, where two men, separated by thousands of miles of dark forests and sleeping villages, are whispering to one another across the void. When we read the history of the great empires, we see massive statues of bronze and stone. We see titles that sound like thunder, the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of all Russia. But beneath the heavy crowns of gold and the sparkling military medals, history is always, beautifully, and tragically human. Tonight, let us strip away the titles. Let us look at two cousins. Let us simply call them Willie and Nicky. Imagine a beautiful, fading memory from a long-ago summer. The air is warm and smells faintly of saltwater and blooming jasmine. Two boys, dressed in matching white sailor suits, are running across the manicured lawns of a grand palace, laughing as they chase a stray dog. They are cousins, bound by the intricate, sprawling family tree of European royalty. They share summer vacations on the Baltic Sea. They share inside jokes, quiet secrets, and the unique, isolating burden of knowing that one day, they will both be expected to rule the world. But time is a river that carries us all away from the sunlit gardens of our childhood. It is now the breathless, terrifying end of July. The boys are grown men. The world around them is fracturing, and the invisible machines of war have begun to hum in the dark. Let us travel to the vast, snow-swept empire of the East. In the heart of St. Petersburg, inside a magnificent palace, the Tsar of Russia is sitting alone at his desk. Nicky is a quiet, deeply gentle man. He is a man who loves to photograph his children playing in the snow, a man who sits by the bed of his frail, sickly son, reading him stories and weeping quietly when the boy is in pain. He wears the crown of an absolute monarch, but in his heart, he is simply a father who is terrified of the dark clouds gathering over his home. The heavy velvet curtains of his study are drawn tight against the night. A single oil lamp casts a warm, golden glow over a piece of white parchment on his desk. He knows that his generals are demanding to march. He knows that the massive, slow-moving gears of the Russian army are groaning to life. But he cannot bear the thought of the young men in his villages, the boys who work the fields and tend the horses, being sent into the fire. And so, he reaches out for the fragile thread. He takes his pen, and he writes directly to his cousin in Berlin. He does not use the cold, formal language of diplomacy. He writes from the heart. He writes, "My dear cousin, I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far." He signs it, simply, Nicky. Imagine that message, turned into invisible electrical pulses, traveling through the dark night. It hums along the copper wires, flying over the deep, silent pine forests of Poland, over the sleeping farmers in their small wooden cottages, over the old, winding rivers that know nothing of borders or empires. It arrives in the hushed, anxious halls of the Chancellery in Berlin. Here, the Kaiser is pacing the floor. Willie, the man who built a fortress of steel around his fragile heart, is realizing that the walls are closing in. When the telegram is placed gently onto his desk, he stops pacing. He looks at the signature. Nicky. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, the heavy armor of the Emperor falls away. He remembers the boy in the sailor suit. He remembers the warmth of the summer sun on their faces. He feels a sudden, desperate surge of hope. Perhaps, if they just speak to one another as family, they can reach past the generals, past the maps, and stop the clocks. Willie sits down at his desk. His hand, the good hand that he uses to sign his name, trembles slightly as he drafts his reply. He writes, "I share your wish that peace should be maintained. I shall use my entire influence to induce Austria to obtain a frank and satisfactory understanding with you. Your very sincere and devoted friend and cousin." He signs it, Willie. For a few quiet hours in the dead of night, these telegrams fly back and forth across the abyss. They are a deeply moving, tragic dance of two men trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands. They plead with one another. They offer gentle reassurances. They beg the other to simply hold their armies back, just for one more day, just for one more hour. This exchange of intimate, personal letters between two of the most powerful men on earth is one of the most profoundly human moments in all of history. It reminds us that behind the grand curtains of the past, there are always real, breathing people, sharing their private fears and unfiltered emotions. Unearthing these personal stories, and looking closely at the uncensored humanity of those who came before us, is what makes history so deeply beautiful. If you find comfort and fascination in these quiet, intimate glimpses into the past, I would love to invite you to join our quiet community on Patreon. It is a gentle, welcoming space where we dive deep into the personal, uncensored stories of history, exploring the raw, unfiltered letters and deep dives that simply cannot be shared everywhere else, complete with ad-free podcasts to keep you company in the quiet hours. It is a place for history lovers to gather and share the true heartbeat of the past. Please, To keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Let us return softly to the flickering light of the study. As the night wears on, the tone of the telegrams begins to change. The fragile thread connecting the two cousins is pulled tighter and tighter by forces entirely beyond their control. In St. Petersburg, Nicky is visited by his ministers of war. They are tall, stern men, their chests heavy with medals. They stand in the shadows of his study and speak to him with voices of quiet, unrelenting panic. They tell him that the trains in Germany are already smoking. They tell him that if he does not order his own men to march, Russia will be entirely defenseless. Nicky looks at them, his eyes filled with tears, and begs them to wait. He says, "I am talking to Willie. We are fixing it." But the generals shake their heads. To them, the cousins are just ghosts talking in the dark. The machine requires blood, not ink. In Berlin, Willie is surrounded by the same shadows. His own commanders, the men who inherited the cold, mathematical dream of the perfect defense, tell him that the window of survival is closing. They tell him that Russia is mobilizing, that the giant in the east is waking up, and that every minute he spends writing letters to his cousin is a minute lost. Willie looks down at the telegram from Nicky. He realizes, with a crushing, suffocating despair, that his crown is entirely hollow. He is the Emperor of Germany, but he is a prisoner of his own army. The tragedy of the Willie-Nicky telegrams is the tragedy of absolute powerlessness. These two men had spent their entire lives being told they were appointed by the heavens to rule. They had been treated as gods on earth. But in the final, agonizing hours of peace, they discovered that they were nothing more than ornaments on the hood of a massive, unstoppable engine. Listen to the final messages crossing the wire. They are no longer hopeful. They are the sound of the thread breaking. Nicky writes, with the desperate, quiet sorrow of a man watching a fire approach his home, "Understand that I am obliged to mobilize. We are far from wishing war. As long as the negotiations with Austria take place, my troops shall not make any provocative action. I give you my solemn word for this." But Willie, cornered, terrified, and pressured by the relentless ticking of his own military's clocks, can no longer accept a promise. He replies, sadly and finally, "I have gone to the utmost limits of the possible in my efforts to save the peace of the world. The responsibility for the disaster which is now threatening the whole civilized world will not be laid at my door. In this moment it still lies in your power to avert it." They are no longer speaking as cousins. They are speaking as prisoners, shifting the heavy, unbearable weight of guilt across the void, knowing that neither of them can carry it. The telegraph wire falls entirely silent. The operator in Berlin takes off his headset. He turns off the small brass lamp at his station. The room goes dark. In St. Petersburg, Nicky rests his head against the heavy mahogany wood of his desk, the unsigned papers of war scattered around him like fallen autumn leaves. In Berlin, Willie stands by his window, looking out into the misty, pre-dawn gray of the city, watching the first light of a morning that will change the world forever. They reached across the abyss, two boys in sailor suits trying to find one another in the dark, but the abyss was simply too wide, and the machinery of the empires was simply too loud. But as the story of the cousins softly fades into the distance, I want you to feel the profound peace of your own room. The heavy, tragic burdens of those old kings belong to the past. Their tears have long since dried, and the empires they worried over have faded into the gentle dust of history. You are entirely safe here. The only wires humming in the night are the quiet, soothing currents of your own thoughts, slowing down, settling into peace. The world outside your window is still and calm. No grand decisions rest upon your shoulders tonight. No heavy crowns to wear, no impossible letters to write. Listen to the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breath, rising and falling like the quiet waves of a peaceful sea. Let the shadows of the old palaces dissolve into nothingness. Let go of the day. Release the tension from your hands, from your shoulders, and drift softly away, down into a deep, beautiful, and unbroken slumber. A single choice can sometimes feel as heavy as the entire world. In the soft, fading light of a midsummer evening in 1914, that weight hung over the city of Berlin like a thick, velvet curtain. If you had been there, walking along the banks of the Spree or beneath the lime trees of Unter den Linden, you might have felt a strange, electric stillness in the air. It was the kind of silence that precedes a great storm, a moment where the heartbeat of a nation seems to slow down, holding its breath before the first drop of rain falls. For the men sitting in the high-ceilinged rooms of the Wilhelmstrasse, the world had become a game of shadows and light. They spoke of grand strategies and the movement of millions, but if you looked closer, you would see only tired men with ink-stained fingers and heavy eyes. They were caught in a mechanism they had helped build but could no longer fully control. They called it the iron dice. To cast them was to let go of the shore and surrender to the current. There is a profound sadness in the realization that once the dice are thrown, the hand that held them is no longer in command. In those quiet offices, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg sat at his desk, the wood polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering candle flames. He was a man of deep intellect and even deeper anxieties. He didn't see the world in maps of conquest, but in the fragile threads of a balance that was snapping. He felt that Germany was being squeezed, like a seedling trapped between two stones, and that to stay still was to be crushed. He wasn't thinking of glory in those hours, he was thinking of survival. He felt a terrible, crushing necessity. To him, the war was not a choice of malice, but a tragic move on a chessboard where every other path had been blocked by walls of steel and ancient rivalries. Outside those rooms, the stories were much smaller, and perhaps much more real. Imagine a young man named Karl. He is a clerk in a small shop that sells ribbons and lace. His hands are soft, and he has spent his life measuring out beauty for the women of his neighborhood. On this evening, he sits at his kitchen table, the smell of cabbage soup lingering in the air. He is writing a letter. His hand trembles just slightly, not from fear of a bullet, but from the fear of the unknown. He writes to his mother in the countryside, telling her not to worry. He tells her that the harvest will be good this year, even if he isn't there to help. He speaks of the flowers in the window box and how he remembered to water them. These are the small heroisms of a life about to be interrupted, the quiet care for a flower, the gentle lie to a mother to keep her heart from breaking. In the hallways of the great general staff, the talk was of the Schlieffen Plan. It was a masterpiece of cold, mathematical logic, a plan that relied on the precise ticking of a clock. To the generals, it was a beautiful machine. But to the men who would have to walk its paths, it was a map of exhaustion. They didn't see the arrows on the paper, they felt the weight of the pack on their shoulders and the tightness of new boots. There was a sense of inevitability that is hard for us to grasp now. It was as if a giant spring had been wound so tight that it had to release, and everyone, from the Kaiser in his palace to the baker in his shop, was just waiting for the click. Yet, even in this tension, there were moments of soft, human kindness. At the railway stations, where the great steam engines hissed and groaned, you would see strangers sharing a crust of bread or a cigarette. A conductor might spend an extra second holding a lantern for a woman trying to find her husband's face in the crowd. These were the moments where the strategic chess of the elites met the soft reality of the people. They were all pieces on the board, yes, but they were pieces that felt the cold, pieces that loved, pieces that were afraid of the dark. The tragedy of the iron dice is that they were cast by men who felt they had no other move. They looked at the map of Europe and saw a tightening circle. They saw the vastness of the East and the steel of the West, and they felt a desperate, lonely panic. It was a strategic fear, a cold calculation that whispered that if they did not strike now, they would never have the chance again. It was the logic of a cornered animal, even if the cage was one of their own making. As I sit here in the quiet of the night, surrounded by these fading photographs and the echoes of voices long gone, I feel the weight of these stories pressing down. It is a heavy burden to document such complex historical tragedies, to try and find the human heart inside the cold machinery of war. Researching these moments of quiet resilience and private fear takes a great deal of time and emotional energy. I do it because I believe these stories deserve to be told with tenderness, but I cannot do it alone. If you find peace in these narrations, if you feel the value in remembering the small moments of kindness amidst the grand shadows of history, please consider supporting this work through our Ko-Fi page. A small tip is like a warm light in a dark room. It helps me continue this massive research and keep these voices alive for you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It would mean so much to have you by my side as we navigate these stories together. The mobilization was not just a movement of soldiers, it was a movement of hearts. In the small villages of the Rhineland, the sound of the church bells took on a different tone. They no longer just called people to prayer. They seemed to be tolling for a world that was slipping away. People gathered in the squares, not with cheers, but with a somber, shared understanding. They looked at one another and saw their own fears reflected in their neighbors' eyes. There was a quiet resilience in the way they went about their tasks, the way a blacksmith finished a shoe for a horse he knew might never return, or the way a teacher carefully closed his books, wondering when the schoolhouse would be full of children's laughter again. There is a story of a young woman named Clara, whose husband was called to the front in those early days of August. She didn't cry when he left. Instead, she tucked a small, dried bluebell from their wedding bouquet into the pocket of his tunic. She didn't speak of strategy or the fate of empires. She simply whispered, "Remember the way home." That was the strategy of the people, not to conquer, but to return. Not to win a game of chess, but to keep the hearth fire burning. The iron dice phrase is often used to describe the coldness of the decision, but we must remember that the dice were made of the lives of millions. Every time a general moved a marker on a map, 1,000 Claras and Karls felt the ground shift beneath them. The tragedy of Germany's position was the belief that the only way to protect their future was to gamble it all on a single throw. It was a gamble born of a specific kind of loneliness, the loneliness of a nation that felt it had no friends, only rivals. When the trains finally began to roll, the sound was like a low, constant thrumming in the earth. It was the sound of a million goodbyes. The air in the stations was thick with the smell of coal smoke and wet wool. And yet, even there, in the middle of the most efficient mobilization the world had ever seen, there was poetry. There were the letters written on the backs of envelopes, the shared flasks of coffee, the hands held through open train windows until the very last second. These were the threads that held the world together even as it was being pulled apart. The strategic chess behind the war is a story of grand designs, but the history of the war is a story of human skin and bone. The men who made the decisions were often blinded by their own maps, unable to see the individual faces in the masses they moved. They saw the French front or the Russian steamroller, but they didn't see the way a young boy in Bavaria hugged his dog one last time before walking to the recruitment office. They didn't see the way a grandmother in East Prussia sat on her porch, watching the horizon with a quiet, steady gaze, refusing to leave the home she had built with her own two hands. Germany felt it had to start the war because it had convinced itself that time was a predator. They felt the ticking of the clock in every diplomatic cable and every military report. To them, the iron dice were not just a choice, but an escape. They threw them hoping to break the cycle of fear, not realizing that they were only stepping into a deeper, darker one. It is a lesson in the danger of feeling trapped, the danger of believing that the only way forward is through the fire. As the sun set on that final day of peace, the shadows grew long over the fields of Europe. The birds sang their evening songs, unaware that the world they flew over was about to change forever. In the quiet houses, families sat down to dinner, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound in the room. They were savoring the ordinary, the precious, simple moments of a life without conflict. They were holding onto the peace as long as they could, like a dream that fades the moment you wake up. The weight of the iron dice was heavy indeed, but it was a weight shared by everyone. It was the weight of a father's hand on a son's shoulder, the weight of a letter carried in a pocket, the weight of a silence that stretched from the palaces of Berlin to the smallest cottage in the Black Forest. It was the weight of being human in a world that had suddenly become a machine. And as the night deepened and the stars came out, the world waited. The dice were in the air, spinning through the dark, and all anyone could do was wait for them to land, and hope that somewhere, in the middle of the storm, there would still be room for kindness, for memory, and for the long, slow journey back home. Sleep now, and remember that history is not just a list of names and dates. It is a tapestry of people just like us, who lived, and loved, and tried their best in a world that felt too big for them. The dice have been cast, but the stories, the real stories, are the ones we carry in our hearts, the ones that remind us of our shared humanity, even in the deepest of shadows. Softly now, let the past rest, and find peace in the quiet of the night. A single steam whistle can sound like the loneliest music in the world. As the sun began to dip behind the iron gables of the station, the air was filled with a thick, white haze of coal smoke and the soft, rhythmic panting of locomotives waiting to depart. This was the moment where the grand, cold strategies of generals and kings finally met the warm, trembling hands of the people. For weeks, the talk in the high halls of Berlin had been of encirclement, of the ticking clock, and of the strategic necessity of a swift strike to the west. But here, on the crowded platforms of Munich, Dresden, and Hamburg, there was no talk of chess or maps. There was only the scent of wet wool, the taste of salt in the air, and the quiet, heartbreaking beauty of saying goodbye. Imagine a young man named Peter. He is standing by a luggage trolley, his new leather boots feeling heavy and strange on his feet. He is only 19, with eyes that still hold the gentle light of the farm he grew up on. In his pocket, he carries a small, smooth stone he found in the brook behind his mother's kitchen. It is his anchor, a piece of home he can touch when the world feels too vast and frightening. Beside him stands his sister, Martha. She is carefully adjusting the collar of his tunic, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate grace. She wants this moment to last, to stretch out into an eternity where the train never arrives and the world stays exactly as it is. She doesn't speak of the war or the reasons why Germany felt it had to move first. She only whispers to him to remember to change his socks when they get damp, and to write to her about the sunsets in the west. Around them, the station is a sea of small heroisms. There is an older man, a veteran of a different time, who stands perfectly still, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who looks far too young to be leaving. He isn't giving advice on how to fight, he is simply offering the steady weight of his presence, a silent promise that he will watch over the boy's family while he is away. There is a woman sitting on a wooden bench, her lap filled with brown paper parcels. She is sharing her small stash of apples with a group of soldiers she has never met, her face tired but illuminated by a soft, motherly kindness. In this moment of national crisis, the people didn't turn to anger. They turned toward one another. The strategic chess of the war, the fear of being crushed between two giants, the belief that a delay of even a few days could mean the end of the nation, this was the invisible burden these men carried. They felt a quiet resilience, a sense that they were doing what must be done to protect the quiet lives they were leaving behind. They didn't see themselves as conquerors. They saw themselves as shields. To them, the strategic chess was simply the heavy price of keeping their gardens safe and their children fed. They believed that by moving now, they were ensuring a shorter path back to these very platforms. If you could listen closely to the murmurs on the platform, you would hear 1,000 different prayers and 1,000 different fears. You would hear the soft rustle of paper as letters were tucked into pockets, letters that promised to be home by the time the leaves turned gold, letters that spoke of unplanted gardens and unfinished stories. There was a young couple, Anna and Karl, standing near the edge of the track. They weren't crying. Instead, they were playing a game, imagining all the things they would do when the winter came. They talked of ice skating on the pond and the smell of cinnamon in the oven. It was a way of building a wall against the uncertainty, a way of keeping the future alive in a moment where the present felt so fragile. As these young men stepped onto those wooden floorboards and felt the vibration of the engine beneath their feet, they were stepping into a legacy that would change the world forever. They were the visible heroes of a visible war, marching in their thousands under the bright summer sun. But their sacrifice and the lessons learned in these grand movements paved the way for a different kind of history, one that happened in the shadows, far from the steam of the stations. It reminds me of how the open battlefields and the clear, painful partings of 1914 eventually gave way to the hidden world of spies, covert missions, and the silent figures who worked in the dark during the next great conflict. Just as we find comfort in these personal stories of the Great War, there is a fascinating, deeper layer to the history that followed, a world of secret operations that shaped the destiny of millions from behind a veil. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden threads of history, I would love for you to join our community by signing up for our email newsletter. As a warm thank you, I'll send you our free ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It's a gentle exploration of the quiet, invisible courage that mirrored the resilience we see here on the platform. It's my way of offering you a little more light in the darkness of the past. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. I want our journey through these stories to be one of safety and trust, like a conversation between old friends. The station began to tremble as the first of the great iron wheels started to turn. The sound of the steam increased, a long, low sigh that seemed to echo the breath of the crowd. This was the most difficult moment, the slow, agonizing separation. Hands reached out from windows, fingers brushing against fingers for one last heartbeat of connection. There was no shouting, no frantic noise. There was only a profound, dignified silence, broken only by the clanking of the couplings. A young soldier, perhaps no more than 18, leaned out of a carriage window. He saw an old woman standing alone, her hands tucked into her apron. She wasn't waving to anyone in particular, she was just there to witness the departure. The boy reached into his bag and pulled out a small, dried flower he had been keeping. With a shy smile, he dropped it into her hand as the train slowly gathered speed. It was a tiny gesture, a small spark of humanity in the face of a massive, industrial machine. The woman clutched the flower to her chest and nodded, a silent recognition of the life that was moving away from her. The trains were not just carrying men, they were carrying the hopes of a nation that felt it had been backed into a corner. The strategic chess had dictated that this was the only way, that the survival of the culture, the language, and the hearth required this painful exodus. But as the trains disappeared into the evening mist, the strategy faded, leaving behind only the human cost. The platforms, once so full of life and movement, were suddenly empty and cold. The only things left were a few dropped ribbons, the smell of coal smoke, and the heavy, lingering silence of those who now had to walk home alone. In the small houses nearby, the lamps were being lit. The rhythm of life continued, though it felt different now, hollower, more precious. Mothers sat by windows, watching the tracks until the last glow of the taillights vanished. They weren't thinking of the Schlieffen Plan or the balance of power in the East. They were thinking of the way their sons laughed, the way they liked their tea, and the way the house felt too quiet without the sound of their footsteps. This was the quiet resilience of the home front, the heroism of carrying on when the heart is miles away. There is a story of a station master who, after the last troop train had left his small village, went out onto the tracks with a broom. He spent an hour carefully sweeping away the soot and the debris, making the station clean and ready for the day when the men would return. He did it every day, a small, private ritual of hope. He believed that if he kept the station perfect, it would somehow call them back sooner. It is in these small, quiet acts that we find the true spirit of that time, not in the grand declarations of war, but in the steady, patient love of those who waited. The departure at the station was a closing of a door. The peace of the old world was being left behind on the platform, while the uncertainty of the new world weighted down the tracks. Yet, even in that transition, the human spirit remained unbroken. The letters written in those first few days were filled with a strange, soft optimism. They spoke of the beauty of the countryside they were passing through, the kindness of the people who brought them water at the stops, and the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. They found comfort in the shared experience, in the knowledge that they were all carrying the same stones in their pockets and the same names in their hearts. As we think of those trains moving through the dark German night, let us remember the faces in the windows. Let us remember that behind every strategic decision, there were thousands of stories of farewell. The strategic chess may have moved the pieces, but it was the people who felt the cold of the board. They lived with a grace and a quiet courage that still resonates today, a reminder that even when the world is swept up in the currents of history, the individual heart remains a place of warmth and light. Close your eyes now and listen to the fading echo of that steam whistle. It is a soft sound now, drifting away into the hills. The station is quiet, the tracks are still, and the world is holding its breath. The stories of those who left and those who stayed are woven into the very air we breathe, a testament to the enduring power of love and the quiet strength of the human soul. Sleep peacefully, knowing that these stories are kept safe, and that the light of those small heroisms never truly goes out. It stays with us, a gentle guide through the long reaches of the night. The sound of 10,000 footfalls is not a roar, but a steady, rhythmic heartbeat against the stone. If you were to close your eyes and listen, you might think it was the sound of a great, slow-moving river, or the heavy pulse of the earth itself waking up in the early light of dawn. This was the sound of August 1914, the sound of boots on cobblestones. It was a sound that filled the narrow streets of border towns and echoed off the brick walls of sleepy villages, a constant, low-frequency hum that signaled the world was no longer standing still. For the young men in those boots, the sound was their entire world. Imagine a young man named Friedrich. Just weeks ago, he was a woodcarver in the Black Forest, his fingers more accustomed to the gentle curve of a lindenwood bird than the cold steel of a rifle. Now, his world has been reduced to the rhythmic sway of the man in front of him and the weight of his pack. There is a strange, meditative peace in the march. When you walk for hours under a warm summer sun, the grand reasons for the war, the strategic chess, the alliances, the fears of encirclement, begin to fade into the background. They are replaced by the simple, immediate realities of the body, the way the dust settles in the creases of your eyes, the dry heat at the back of your throat, and the constant, steady thud-thud-thud of leather against stone. Friedrich isn't thinking about the Schlieffen Plan or the high-stakes gamble of the German general staff. He is thinking about the way his boots feel. They are new, the leather stiff and smelling of oil, and they carry the weight of his entire life. Inside his left boot, tucked against his heel, is a small piece of soft flannel his mother gave him. She told him it would prevent blisters, but to Friedrich, it is more than that. It is a piece of home, a soft secret hidden within the hard machinery of war. Every step he takes is a step further from the forest, yet that tiny scrap of cloth keeps him tethered to the kitchen table, the smell of pine, and the sound of his mother's voice. This was the tragedy of the strategic chess. The men in the high offices of Berlin had looked at the map and saw lines of movement, timetables, and the cold necessity of speed. They believed that to save the future, they had to move through the present with an unstoppable momentum. They saw the march as a mathematical equation. If X number of boots covered Y amount of ground in Z number of days, the nation would be safe. But they couldn't see the blisters. They couldn't feel the private fears that each man carried under his great tunic. They didn't hear the quiet prayers whispered into the dust. As Friedrich's unit passed through a small, nameless village near the Belgian border, the cobblestones changed. They were older here, worn smooth by centuries of wagon wheels and village festivals. The houses were shuttered, their windows like closed eyes, but Friedrich could feel people watching from behind the slats. There was no cheering here, only a heavy, expectant silence. In one doorway, an elderly woman stood, her hands tucked into a dark apron. As the column moved past, a young soldier a few rows ahead of Friedrich stumbled slightly, his water bottle clattering against his hip. Without a word, the woman stepped forward and held out a simple tin cup filled with cold water from her well. The soldier stopped for only a second, his eyes meeting hers. In that brief moment, the war didn't exist. There was no strategic chess, no great power, just one human being offering a small kindness to another. The soldier drank, nodded his thanks, and stepped back into the rhythm of the march. The woman watched him go, her face a mask of quiet resilience. She didn't see an enemy, she saw someone's son, someone's brother, caught in a tide that neither of them could control. These were the small heroisms of the road, the shared crust of bread, the hand held out to steady a comrade, the silent understanding that they were all, in some way, lost together. The march continued into the evening, the sun casting long, violet shadows across the fields. The dust turned golden in the twilight, swirling around the soldiers like a soft, glowing veil. When they finally stopped to make camp, the silence that followed was almost physical. The men sat on the earth, their bodies aching, their minds drifting back to the lives they had left behind. They didn't talk about the iron dice or the fate of empires. They talked about their feet. They talked about the taste of the water in the last village. They talked about the letters they hoped to receive when the mail wagons caught up to them. There is a letter Friedrich started that night, written by the light of a small, flickering candle. His handwriting was shaky, his fingers stiff from the day's journey. He wrote to his sister, telling her about the flowers he had seen growing by the side of the road, simple blue cornflowers that reminded him of her Sunday dress. He didn't mention the fear that sat like a stone in his stomach, or the way the silence of the night felt heavy with the unknown. He wrote about the beauty of the sunset. This was his quiet heroism, the choice to send home a fragment of light instead of a shadow of darkness. As we look back on these images, the long columns of gray moving through the sun-drenched landscape, it's impossible not to be struck by the sheer visual power of history. The way the light caught the spikes of the helmets, the way the dust rose like incense behind the horses, the way the faces of the men seemed to blur into a single, collective soul. It is a visual history that has been captured and honored by filmmakers and historians for generations, allowing us to see the humanity within the tragedy. To see these moments brought to life with such care and vivid detail is a powerful way to connect with the past. If you find yourself moved by the visual legacy of these great conflicts, you might find a similar sense of honoring the past in cinematic masterpieces like the movie Midway on Amazon Prime, or perhaps in collecting pieces of history through World War II memorabilia available on Amazon. There is something deeply meaningful about holding a piece of history or watching a story unfold on screen that pays tribute to the courage of those who came before us. It's a way for us to remember, to see the faces behind the facts, and to keep their stories alive in our own homes. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. I want your journey into the past to be as safe and peaceful as the stories we share here at night. The nights on the march were a time of deep, private reflection. As the campfires died down to glowing embers, the men would wrap themselves in their greatcoats and look up at the stars. It was the same sky that hung over their homes, the same stars that their wives and children were looking at miles away. In the dark, the strategic chess felt very far away, almost like a dream. The only reality was the cold ground beneath them and the steady breathing of their friends nearby. There was a soldier named Wilhelm who carried a small, silver locket. It didn't have a picture inside, but it held a tiny lock of his daughter's hair. Every night before he slept, he would run his thumb over the smooth surface of the silver. He wasn't marching for glory or for territory. He was marching because he believed that by following the path laid out by the generals, he was protecting that lock of hair and the little girl it belonged to. He saw the war as a terrible, necessary bridge that he had to cross to get back to his own front door. He, like millions of others, was a piece on a chessboard, but his heart was entirely elsewhere. The cobblestones they walked upon had seen many armies pass throughout the centuries. They had felt the boots of Napoleonic soldiers, the sandals of Roman legionaries, and the wooden clogs of peasants. The stones were indifferent to the strategy, they only knew the weight of the feet that pressed upon them. There is a profound, quiet resilience in the earth itself, a sense that while the strategic chess of men may change the maps, the ground remains, holding the echoes of every footfall. In those early days, the war still felt like a journey, an arduous and strange adventure. The reality of what lay ahead was still hidden behind the next hill, the next forest, the next day's march. For now, there was only the movement. There was the sound of a harmonica played softly by a campfire, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the shared exhaustion that created a bond stronger than any military oath. They were becoming a community of the road, a brotherhood of the cobblestone. Germany's leaders felt they had to start this movement because they were afraid of being static. They feared that if they didn't march now, they would be trapped in a cage of their neighbors' making. They chose the rhythm of the boots over the silence of diplomacy, believing that movement was the only path to safety. It was a strategic choice made in the high, cold atmosphere of logic, but it was carried out in the warm, dusty air of the human heart. The march did not end when the sun went down. Even in the dark, the sound of the boots continued in the minds of the men. It was a rhythm they would carry for the rest of their lives. Long after the war was over, those who returned would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, hearing that steady thud-thud-thud against the stone. It was the sound of their youth, the sound of their sacrifice, and the sound of a world that had decided to walk away from peace. Close your eyes now and feel the rhythm of those footfalls. They are getting softer now, fading into the distance as the column moves further down the road. The dust is settling, the stars are bright, and the night is quiet once more. The stories of Friedrich, Wilhelm, and the woman in the doorway remain, tiny flickers of light in the vast shadow of history. Sleep peacefully, knowing that while the chess pieces move, it is the small moments of kindness and the quiet strength of the heart that truly endure. The march is long, but the night is gentle, and you are safe here in the quiet of the past. A scrap of paper, yellowed by time and smudged by the dust of a long-forgotten road, can hold more weight than all the gold in a king's treasury. When we look back at the grand movements of 1914, we often see only the maps, the arrows of invasion, and the cold, calculated logic of the men in Berlin who felt they had to strike first to survive. But if you were to walk through the camps at night, past the glowing embers of the fires and the huddle of sleeping forms, you would find the true history of the war written in the small, flickering circles of candlelight. You would find it in the letters. The men who marched across the borders weren't just soldiers, they were sons, fathers, and brothers who carried their entire worlds in their breast pockets. They were pieces in a game of strategic chess, yes, but they were pieces that bled, and dreamt, and remembered the smell of rain on a summer afternoon. For them, the war was not a matter of grand alliances or the iron dice of fate. It was a long, dusty separation from everything they loved. Imagine a young man named Klaus. He sits with his back against a stone wall, his boots unlaced for the first time in 3 days. His hands, once steady enough to repair the delicate internal gears of pocket watches, are now rough and stained with the gray soil of the frontier. He is writing to his wife, Greta. He doesn't tell her about the fear that sits like a cold stone in his belly when the sun goes down. He doesn't tell her about the strategic necessity of the march or the fear of encirclement that the officers talk about. Instead, he writes about the coffee. He tells her it is bitter and thin, nothing like the brew she makes on their stove at home. He tells her about a stray cat he saw in a ruined barn, and how it reminded him of the way their own cat sleeps in the sun. This is the quiet heroism of the ordinary man. In the face of a world-shattering conflict, Klaus chooses to focus on a cat and a cup of coffee. He is trying to build a bridge of words back to his kitchen table, back to a life where the most important thing was the ticking of a clock and the warmth of a shared meal. The leaders of Germany felt they had to start the war to protect their future, but men like Klaus were simply trying to protect the present, one letter at a time. There is a profound sadness in these letters from the dust. They are filled with a resilience that doesn't roar, but whispers. In another camp, a man named Stefan writes to his mother. He tells her not to worry about the harvest, even though he knows his father's back is weak and the fields are vast. He gives her instructions on how to fix the fence near the creek, his words a gentle guide for a life he is no longer there to lead. He writes with a calm, steady hand, hiding his own exhaustion so that she might sleep a little easier. He is a shield for her heart, even as he stands in the path of a storm. In the letters, we see the strategic chess for what it truly was, a machine that required the oil of human tears to keep its gears turning. The strategic fear of being crushed between East and West led to the order to march, but the march led to these moments of quiet, private heartbreak. You can almost hear the scratch of the pencils against the paper, a soft, rhythmic sound that competed with the distant rumble of the horizon. Each letter was a small act of defiance against the coldness of history. Sometimes, the letters didn't even have to be sent to carry meaning. There was a soldier who found a crumpled envelope in a field, dropped by a man in a different uniform. He couldn't read the language, but he understood the photograph inside, a woman holding a small child, her eyes squinting against the sun. He didn't see an enemy in that moment. He saw a mirror. He saw the same private fears and the same small hopes. He tucked the photo back into the envelope and left it on a stone, weighted down by a pebble so it wouldn't blow away. It was a moment of kindness in a world that was rapidly losing its way. These letters were the raw, unfiltered truth of the war. They were the voices that the official histories often forget to record. They told the story of the mud, the hunger, and the overwhelming longing for a home that felt further away with every step. They were the uncensored reality of what it meant to be a human being caught in the middle of a strategic gamble. As I spend these long nights researching these personal accounts, I often feel a heavy responsibility to show you the world as these men truly saw it, not just the polished version found in textbooks, but the raw, human experience. It's why I've spent so much time gathering materials that offer a more direct connection to the past. If you feel a calling to see the history of these conflicts without the veil, I've put together something special on our Gumroad store. It's a digital collection of raw, unseen images and historical records that capture the unfiltered reality of the wars. Just like these private letters, these images tell a story that words alone sometimes cannot. They are a tribute to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unthinkable, and by exploring them, you help support the deep, emotional research that goes into these narrations. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It means the world to me that we can share these truths together, safely and sincerely. There was a silence that followed the writing of these letters. Once the paper was folded and tucked away, the men would sit in the dark, watching the stars. They wondered if the same moon was shining over the roofs of their villages. They wondered if their letters would ever make it through the chaos of the rail lines and the busy hands of the censors. But the act of writing was enough. It was a way of saying, I am still here. I am still the man who loves the garden and the smell of the pine forest. I am not just a number on a list. In the villages back home, the arrival of the postman became the most important moment of the day. Women would stand at their gates, their hearts racing at the sound of a footstep. A letter from the front was like a breath of air to a drowning person. They would read the words over and over until the ink began to fade, searching for the hidden meanings between the lines. They knew their men were being brave for them, and so they were brave in return. They wrote back about the small things, the way the neighbor's dog barked at the moon, the price of eggs, the growth of the children. It was a conversation of the ordinary, held across a distance that felt like the end of the world. The resilience of these families was the anchor that held the nation together. While the strategists in the capital worried about the movement of armies, the people in the cottages worried about the movement of a single soul. Their letters were a web of love that stretched across the continent, a fragile but unbreakable net that caught the falling hearts of the soldiers. It was the strategic chess of the soul, a move made against the darkness of despair. History tells us that Germany felt it had to start the war because the window of opportunity was closing. They saw the maps, they saw the railroads of their rivals, and they felt a desperate, cold necessity. But the letters tell us that for the people, there was no opportunity in war, only loss. There was the loss of the quiet morning, the loss of the Sunday walk, and the loss of the simple peace that comes from knowing those you love are safe in the next room. There is a story of a letter found decades later in the lining of an old tunic. It was never sent. It was a letter from a young man to his father, apologizing for a small argument they had had before he left. It was a letter seeking forgiveness, a letter seeking a return to a simpler time. It reminds us that behind every strategic decision, there were a million private reconciliations that never got to happen. There were a million words left hanging in the air, swallowed by the dust of the march. As the war progressed, the letters became shorter, the pencils more worn. But the essence remained the same. They were a cry for recognition. Remember me, they seemed to say. Remember me not as a soldier of the Kaiser, but as the man who liked to sit by the fire. Remember me as the one who carved the little wooden birds for the children. They were fighting for their place in the memory of the world, a world that was being reshaped by the cold logic of the iron dice. Let us think of those letters now, drifting like leaves across the years. They are fragile things, easily torn, easily lost, yet they carry the strongest force in human history, the desire to be known and to be loved. The strategic chess of the war eventually ended, the boards were cleared, and the kings were put away. But the letters remain. They are the echoes of the human heart, speaking to us from the dust, reminding us that even in the midst of the greatest tragedies, the smallest moments of kindness and the simplest words of love are what truly matter. Close your eyes now and imagine the soft rustle of those pages. The campfires are going out, and the soldiers are drifting into a restless sleep. The letters are tucked safely away, held close to hearts that beat with the hope of home. The night is vast, the road is long, but the words are written, and they are beautiful. Sleep now, and listen to the whispers of the past, for in those letters from the dust, we find the gentle, enduring truth of who we are. The story is long, but the night is kind, and you are here, safe in the quiet of the memory. The sun does not set with a bang, but with a slow, golden sigh that turns the world to amber. In those final, stretching moments of the summer of 1914, the long shadows of the old world were reaching across Europe, touching every palace balcony and every humble garden gate. It was the end of an era that had felt as though it would last forever, a time when empires were thought to be as permanent as the mountains. But beneath the surface, the foundations were shifting like sand. The grand chess game of the great powers had reached a point where the players felt they could no longer pull back their hands from the board. For Germany, caught in the center of the fray, the sunset was not just the end of a day, but the beginning of a long, dark night they felt they were forced to walk into. Imagine a man named Hermann. He is a watchmaker in a quiet town in Saxony. His shop is small, filled with the gentle, rhythmic ticking of 100 different hearts made of brass and steel. To Hermann, time is a beautiful, orderly thing. He understands that for a clock to work, every gear must fit perfectly, every spring must have the right tension. But as he stands in his doorway on this particular evening, watching the sky turn from violet to deep indigo, he feels a tension in the air that no spring can hold. He has heard the talk of the encirclement, the whispers that Germany's neighbors were tightening a noose of steel around the nation's throat. He doesn't know the intricacies of the treaties or the secret maps, but he knows the feeling of a clock that is about to strike a heavy hour. He feels a quiet, cold fear, not for himself, but for the order of his world. He wonders if the ticking will ever sound the same again. This was the private heart of the strategic tragedy. To the leaders in Berlin, the world had become a mechanism of suffocating pressure. They looked at the map and saw the vastness of the east and the iron of the west, and they truly believed that to stay still was to be crushed. They felt a desperate, heavy necessity to act while they still had the strength to move. It wasn't a desire for the fires of war, but a tragic belief that the fire was already coming, and they had to be the ones to strike the match to control the blaze. In their minds, the sun was setting on their chance to survive, and the iron dice had to be thrown before the light vanished entirely. In the midst of this grand, terrifying logic, there was Elsa. She was a young woman who had spent her life learning the quiet art of healing. In a small clinic, she spent her days folding linens and mixing herbal salves. She was a person of immense, quiet resilience. When the news of the mobilization reached her village, she didn't join the crowds in the street. Instead, she went to her workroom and began to double her efforts. She saw the everyday heroism in the way her neighbors continued to bake their bread and mend their fences, even as their hearts were heavy with the unknown. Elsa's heroism was in her hands, in the way she moved with a calm, soothing grace, offering a steadying presence to the mothers who came to her with tear-stained faces. She didn't speak of empires, she spoke of the importance of keeping one's lamp lit against the dark. The sun was setting on the palaces, too. Behind the gilded walls of the new palace in Potsdam, the Kaiser walked the gardens alone. He was a man of grand gestures and loud words, but in the quiet of the evening, he was just a man who felt the weight of his ancestors pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at the portraits of the kings who came before him and felt a crushing loneliness. He had tried to play the game of chess, but the pieces had become too heavy to lift. He felt trapped by the very military machine he had helped to build, a machine that now demanded a forward motion he couldn't stop. There is a profound sadness in a ruler who realizes that his crown is not a symbol of power, but a heavy iron ring that binds him to a fate he no longer controls. As these empires began to tremble and the old truths started to fade, the people were left searching for something real to hold on to. They looked for honesty in the letters from the front, for truth in the eyes of their neighbors, and for a way to understand the massive forces that were pulling their lives apart. In our own time, we find ourselves doing much the same. We look back at these moments of falling empires and shifting sands, trying to find the uncensored, honest heart of the story. We search for the hidden threads that the official histories sometimes overlook. This search for the deeper, more human truth is what we strive for every day. It's why we've built a special community for those who want to go beyond the surface of history. On our Patreon, we offer uncensored deep dives and podcasts where we can explore the complexities of these tragedies with the honesty they deserve. It's a place where we can talk as friends, sharing the stories of the quiet heroes and the hidden maneuvers that shaped our world. If you feel a connection to this journey and want to support the hundreds of hours of research that go into uncovering these narratives, I would be so honored to have you join us. It's a way for us to keep the light of truth burning together, even when the subject matter feels heavy. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Your safety and your trust mean everything to me as we navigate these shadows together. As the light finally disappeared from the horizon, a different kind of life began in the camps and the trenches that were starting to scar the earth. There was a soldier named Karl who, on his first night away from home, found himself sharing a small tin of jam with a man he had met only hours before. They sat in the dark, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke around them, and talked in low whispers about the homes they had left behind. Karl spoke of the way the sun looked hitting the copper spire of his village church. His companion spoke of the taste of fresh milk. These were the small, beautiful heroisms of the spirit, the refusal to let the grand machinery of war strip away the things that made them human. In the darkness of the setting empire, they were creating a small, private light of their own. There is a letter written by a young officer to his father, a man who had served in the wars of the previous century. The son wrote, "The world we knew is gone, father. The sun has set on the garden parties and the quiet afternoons. We are in a new time now, a time of iron and shadows. But I will try to remember the lessons you taught me, not the lessons of the sword, but the lessons of the heart. I will try to be kind, even when the world is not. This was the quiet resilience that Germany carried into the conflict. They felt the must of the strategic chess, the terrible weight of the choice to start the war, but they also carried the hope that they could remain themselves through the fire. The sunset of 1914 was a beautiful, terrible thing. It was the last time the world would look so simple, so gilded in the light of the old century. The strategic chess had dictated that the board must be cleared, and so the pieces were moved with a cold, mathematical precision. But the chess players forgot that the pieces were made of flesh and blood. They forgot that every move meant a watchmaker like Hermann would lose his rhythm, a nurse like Elsa would have to mend broken souls, and a soldier like Karl would have to find his home in a tin of jam shared in the dark. As the stars began to appear, one by one, over the silent fields of Europe, a great hush fell over the continent. The trains were moving, the boots were marching, and the telegrams were flying through the wires. But for a moment, there was a stillness. It was the silence of a world between breaths. Germany had made its choice, driven by a fear that felt like a cold wind at their backs. They had cast the dice, and now they had to watch them fall. But even in that terrifying moment of transition, there was a sense of everyday heroism. It was in the way a father tucked his children into bed, knowing he might not see them for a long time. It was in the way a baker set his dough for the morning, a silent promise that life would go on. These empires were vast and powerful, but they were ultimately made of these small moments. The sun sets on empires, but it never sets on the human spirit. The light might fade from the palaces and the maps might be redrawn in blood and ink, but the quiet resilience of the soul remains. It is the thread that connects us to Hermann, Elsa, and Karl. It is the truth we find when we look past the grand strategies and into the eyes of the people who lived through them. Close your eyes now and feel the cooling air of that long-ago summer evening. The light has gone, and the world is draped in the soft velvet of the night. The ticking of the clocks continues, a steady, comforting heartbeat in the dark. The stories are told, the letters are folded, and the stars are watching over us all. Sleep now, and find peace in the knowledge that even when empires fall, the kindness of a stranger and the love of a family remain as constants in the dark. The world is changing, but you are here, safe in the quiet embrace of history. The sun has set, but the memory remains bright, a gentle guide through the long reaches of the night. The scent of ripening wheat is a memory that never quite leaves the skin, even when the world begins to turn to iron. In the late summer of 1914, the golden fields of Central Europe were heavy with a harvest that many would never see gathered. As the sun beat down on the rolling plains of Belgium and northern France, a different kind of growth was beginning to take root in the soil. The German soldiers who marched through these fields were, for the most part, men of the earth, farmers, gardeners, and sons of the countryside who knew the language of the seasons. They looked at the swaying stalks of grain with a professional eye, noting the quality of the soil and the timing of the rains, even as they carried the heavy weight of a strategic gamble that had turned their scythes into rifles. For the men in the high offices of Berlin, the strategic chess was reaching its most critical move. They had convinced themselves that the only way to save the German home was to march through the neighbor's yard. They spoke of the ticking clock and the Russian steamroller in the east, a fear that if they did not strike a decisive blow in the west immediately, they would be crushed by the sheer weight of numbers from the other side. To the generals, the fields were merely a corridor, a space on a map to be crossed before the winter came. But to the men on the ground, the fields were sacred. Every step they took across a trampled vineyard or a flattened wheat field felt like a wound against their own history. Imagine a man named Hans. Back home in a quiet valley in the Rhineland, Hans was known for the sweetness of his apples. He spent his life tending to the delicate needs of his trees, understanding the patience required to wait for a harvest. Now, he finds himself standing in a field near a village he cannot pronounce, watching as a line of horse-drawn artillery churns the rich, black earth into a muddy ruin. He doesn't think of the grand alliances or the diplomatic failures that led him here. He thinks of the farmer who owns this land, a man he has never met but whom he understands perfectly. He feels a quiet, gnawing guilt, a secret sorrow that the strategy of his nation has required him to destroy the very thing he respects most, the work of a man's hands. Hans carries a small, embroidered handkerchief in his pocket, a gift from his wife, Lotte. It smells faintly of lavender, a scent that seems impossibly fragile amidst the smell of coal smoke and horse sweat. When the march stops and the men are allowed to rest, Hans sits on the edge of a ditch and pulls out the handkerchief, just to hold that scent for a moment. It is his way of staying human, of remembering that he is a gardener in a world that is suddenly demanding he be a destroyer. This is the quiet resilience of the soldier, the ability to hold onto a piece of lavender while standing in the middle of a strategic storm. The harvest of barbed wire began slowly. At first, it was just a few rolls of iron thorns, meant to protect a bridge or a crossroad. But as the momentum of the German advance began to slow, as the mathematical logic of the Schlieffen Plan met the messy, unpredictable resistance of reality, the wire began to grow. It stretched across the fields like a dark, metallic weed, choking the life out of the landscape. The soldiers watched as the golden horizon was carved into jagged segments by the new industrial landscape. The iron dice had been thrown, and they were landing in a field of thorns. Back in Germany, the harvest was being gathered by those left behind. Lotte and the other women of the village were out in the fields before the sun rose, their backs aching as they did the work that the men usually performed. This, too, was a form of everyday heroism, the quiet, steady determination to keep the world turning while the men were away playing the game of kings. Lotte wrote letters to Hans every night, her ink-stained fingers moving slowly by the light of a single candle. She didn't write about the fear of the Russian advance or the strategic necessity of the war. She wrote about the cow that had gone lame and the way the youngest child had started to walk. She was weaving a net of ordinary life, trying to catch her husband before he fell too far into the darkness. It is a heavy task to unearth these quiet, forgotten stories from the scarred earth of history. To find the voice of a gardener in the middle of a world war takes hours of patient labor, a labor of love that I undertake because I believe these small moments of humanity are the only things that can truly explain the tragedy of the past. Documenting the human heart amidst the cold machinery of strategic chess is a journey I am honored to take with you. If you find peace in these stories and value the effort it takes to bring them to light, please consider supporting this work through our Ko-Fi page. A small tip is like a cool drink of water on a long march. It helps me continue this massive research and keep these voices alive for you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Your support is what allows me to keep digging through the dust of the past to find the gold of these human lives. There was a moment, in the heat of a late August afternoon, when Hans's unit came across a small farmhouse that had been caught in the crossfire. The family had fled, but a young calf was trapped in a tangle of fallen timber near the barn. The strategic orders were to keep moving, to maintain the relentless pace that the generals insisted was the only way to win. But Hans and two of his friends stopped. Without a word, they put down their rifles and worked together to lift the heavy beams. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had spent their lives working with their hands. When the calf was free, it stumbled away toward the woods, and for a few seconds, the three men stood in the quiet of the yard, breathing heavily. They didn't look at each other, and they didn't speak of what they had done. They simply picked up their rifles and ran to catch up with their column. But in that small act of kindness, they had struck a blow against the cold logic of the war. They had chosen, if only for 5 minutes, to be the men they were born to be, rather than the pieces on the board they were forced to be. It was a small harvest of mercy in a season of iron. As the days grew shorter, the letters from the front began to change. The dust of the road was being replaced by the mud of the earth. The soldiers were no longer just marching through the fields, they were starting to dig into them. The strategic chess had led them to a place where neither side could move forward, and so they began to burrow, like animals seeking shelter from a predator. The barbed wire, once a stranger in the field, became a permanent resident. It was a harvest of wire that would last for years, a crop that yielded only pain and separation. The private fears of the men became more focused. It wasn't the fear of death in a grand battle that haunted them most, but the fear of being forgotten. They rode home with a desperate urgency, asking for small things, a piece of chocolate, a new pair of socks, a photograph of the garden. These objects were their anchors, the things that kept them from drifting away into the gray, featureless reality of the front. They were holding onto their identity with a quiet, fierce resilience. Hans would often touch the lavender-scented handkerchief in his pocket, a silent prayer that the gardener within him would survive the iron harvest. Germany had felt it had to start the war because it saw no other way to ensure its survival in a world of tightening circles. The leaders had looked at the map and saw a future of decline if they did not act. They chose the harvest of wire because they feared the harvest of defeat. It was a tragic, human error, the belief that safety could be found through the destruction of the very peace they sought to protect. They had cast the dice, but the dice were made of the lives of Hans, Lotte, and millions of others. The strategic chess had failed to account for the spirit of the people. It hadn't factored in the way a woman would manage a farm alone, or the way a soldier would stop to save a trapped calf. The generals saw the fields as geometry, but the people saw them as home. As the sun began to set on the first month of the war, the golden wheat of August was gone, replaced by the silver glint of the wire under the moon. The world had changed, but the heart, the soft, resilient human heart, remained, waiting for the time when the sides would once again be more important than the rifles. Close your eyes now and imagine the quiet of those fields at night. The wind rustles through the wire, making a soft, lonely sound like the humming of a distant song. The soldiers are asleep in their shallow burrows, dreaming of home, dreaming of the scent of apples and the sound of a familiar voice. The harvest is long, and the earth is tired, but the memory of kindness is still there, buried deep beneath the dust. Sleep now, and know that even in the middle of the most complex historical tragedies, the small stories of resilience and love are what truly endure. The night is gentle, the story is safe, and you are here, held in the quiet memory of a world that tried its best to remain human. A map is only paper until it is stained by the rain. In the quiet, hollow hours of a September night in 1914, the grand, meticulous plans of the German High Command began to drift away like smoke in a damp forest. For years, the brightest minds in Berlin had lived within the clean, sharp lines of a mathematical dream. They believed that if every train arrived at its station on the second, and if every soldier stepped with the same rhythmic certainty, the world could be tilted back into balance. They called it a strategic necessity, a defensive strike to prevent a slow death by encirclement. But as the crickets sang in the fields of the Marne, the ink on those plans began to blur, and the ghosts of what was supposed to be began to haunt the men who had drawn them. If you had been standing in the corner of a dimly lit headquarters in a requisitioned chateau, you would have seen a man named Helmuth. He was a man of deep sensitivity, a lover of music and painting, who found himself burdened with the weight of an entire nation's survival. He sat by a window, the glass rattling slightly with the vibration of distant thunder that wasn't actually thunder at all. He looked at the map spread across the heavy oak table, the arrows and circles representing hundreds of thousands of living, breathing souls. He had inherited a plan that was like a delicate clock, beautiful in its complexity, but shattered by a single grain of sand. He felt the crushing realization that the short war was an illusion, and that the iron dice had not landed on glory, but in the mud. He wasn't thinking of territory in that moment. He was thinking of the sheer, quiet terror of a man who realized he had lost control of the machine. Outside, in the reality of the night, the soldiers were the ones living within the fragments of that broken clock. Imagine a man named Lucas. Before the summer, Lucas had been a schoolteacher in a small village where the loudest sound was the wind in the wheat. He was a man who found joy in the precise grammar of a sentence. Now, he found himself standing in a shallow ditch, his uniform heavy with the gray silt of a riverbank. He held a crumpled piece of paper, a map that told him he should be 10 miles further west, in a world that was supposed to be already won. But the map didn't know about the broken bridges or the way the sun drained the strength from a man's legs. Lucas didn't feel like a piece on a chessboard. He felt like a small, tired bird caught in a gale. In his pocket, he kept a wooden ruler he had taken from his desk at school. Sometimes, when the silence of the night became too heavy, he would run his thumb over the smooth, notched edge. It was his way of remembering that the world was once measurable and orderly. It was a small act of quiet resilience, a refusal to let the chaos outside extinguish the teacher within. He looked at the men around him, their faces pale in the moonlight, and saw not a fighting force, but a collection of private histories, bakers, tailors, and fathers, all waiting for a tomorrow that the meticulous plans had failed to provide. There is a profound sadness in the failure of logic. The leaders of Germany had started the war because they were afraid of a future they couldn't control. They thought that a perfect plan could act as a shield against the uncertainty of the world. But the ghosts of those plans were now everywhere, in the unreached goals, the stalled divisions, and the quiet realization that the war of movement was becoming a war of waiting. The grand strategy had been a move to prevent a tragedy, but it had instead become the doorway into a much longer, darker room. As we sit here in the gentle stillness of our own time, looking back at these men trapped in the wreckage of their own calculations, we can see how the failure of these overt, massive plans began to change the very nature of conflict. The world learned that when millions of marching men are stalled, the struggle moves into the shadows. The meticulous, failed maneuvers of the Great War were the painful birth of a different kind of strategy, one that didn't rely on grand maps, but on secrets, whispers, and the quiet work of individuals in the dark. It is a fascinating, hidden thread of history that stretches from the muddy ditches of 1914 into the top-secret operations of the next Great War. If you find yourself drawn to these deeper, more mysterious layers of our shared past, I'd love to share something special with you. I've put together a small collection of stories that explore this shift, the hidden side of history that grew out of the ruins of the old world's plans. If you join our community through our email newsletter, I'll send you a free copy of our ebook. The Shadow War, 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. It's a gentle, intimate look at the covert heroes and the silent turning points that define the era that followed. It's my way of offering you a little more warmth and light as we navigate these complex stories together. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It would be a joy to have you with us, exploring these shadows from a place of safety and friendship. In the trenches that were not yet trenches, just long, jagged scars in the earth, the men began to find ways to live within the failure of the plan. There was a moment of everyday heroism that Lucas witnessed one morning, just as the mist was rising from the river. A young soldier, a boy no older than his own students, had found a small, shivering dog abandoned in a nearby barn. Instead of letting the cold and the hunger of the march harden his heart, the boy shared his last bit of sausage with the creature. He tucked the dog into the fold of his coat, a small, warm heartbeat against his own. The boy wasn't thinking about the strategic chess of the Marne or the failure of the German right wing. He was simply being kind. In that moment, the meticulously planned war of empires was dwarfed by the simple, beautiful reality of a boy and a dog. It was a ghost of a different kind, the ghost of the humanity they were all supposed to have left behind at the border. Lucas watched them and felt a flicker of hope. If a boy could still be kind in the middle of a collapsing dream, then perhaps the world wasn't entirely lost. The letters that went home during this time were filled with a strange, quiet honesty. They didn't speak of victories or the grand designs of the Kaiser. They spoke of the rain. They spoke of how the sound of a church bell in the distance could make a man weep for no reason. One soldier wrote to his mother, "We were told we would be home before the leaves fell." The leaves are turning brown now, and I am still here, sitting in a hole I dug myself. But do not worry, mother. I have found a dry place to keep my boots, and the stars are the same ones that shine over your garden. This was the resilience of a generation that had been told they were part of a perfect, unstoppable machine, only to find they were merely human beings in a very difficult place. They lived within the ghosts of the plans, navigating the gap between what they were promised and what they were experiencing. They found heroism in the small things, in the sharing of a dry crust of bread, in the mending of a comrade's coat, and the silent decision to keep going when the logic of the march had vanished. Germany had felt it had to start the war because the generals believed they could see the future. They looked at the growing power of their neighbors and felt a cold, logical panic. They believed that by casting the iron dice now, they could control the outcome. But the ghosts of their plans tell us that no one can truly see the future. The tragedy was the belief that a plan could be more powerful than the unpredictable, messy, and ultimately tender nature of humanity. As the night deepens over the quiet landscapes of today, we can almost hear the echoes of those pencil marks on the maps of 1914. We can see the tired eyes of Helmuth as he watched the candles burn down, and the steady hands of Lucas as he held his wooden ruler. They were all caught in a story that was much larger than they were, a story where the grand strategies fell away, leaving behind only the individual heart. The sun will rise again over the fields of the Marne, just as it did then. The birds will sing in the trees that grew over the old ditches, and the rain will fall on the earth that has long since forgiven the boots. The ghosts of the meticulous plans have faded into the whispers of history, but the stories of the people remain. They remind us that even when the grandest designs of men fail, the small lights of kindness and the quiet strength of the soul continue to burn. Close your eyes now and feel the softness of the night around you. The world is at rest, and the heavy maps of the past have been folded away. The ticking of the clock is slow and steady, a gentle reminder that time moves on, healing the scars of the old wars. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the humanity of the schoolteacher and the kindness of the boy with the dog are the things that truly endure. The night is long, but it is kind, and you are safe here in the quiet of the story. The evening wind has a way of carrying secrets that the daylight tries to hide. As the autumn of 1914 began to settle over the landscape of Europe, the air changed. It was no longer just the crisp scent of falling leaves or the smell of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. There was something else drifting on the breeze, a low, haunting murmur that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. In the high halls of power, the strategic chess match had reached a point where the pieces were no longer sliding across the board with ease. They were sinking into the mud. The grand gamble, the decision that Germany felt it had to make to ensure its survival against a closing circle of rivals, was beginning to reveal its true, heavy cost. And in the quiet moments between the thunder of the guns, if you listened very closely, you could hear the first, faint whispers of the storms that were yet to come. Imagine a man named Johann. Before the world turned to iron and gray, Johann was a carpenter in a small town tucked away in the Thuringian forest. His hands were used to the scent of cedar and the smooth finish of a well-planed board. Now, those same hands are stained with the cold, dark soil of a trench line that seems to have no end. It is late at night, and the world is draped in a thick, wet fog. Johann is sitting on a wooden crate, trying to carve a small horse from a scrap of pine he found near a shattered barn. He isn't thinking about the encirclement or the strategic chess that the officers talk about in their briefings. He is thinking about his son's birthday, which is only a week away. Johann feels a strange, quiet weight in his chest. It isn't just the fear of the next day, it's a realization that the world he knew has slipped through his fingers like dry sand. He remembers the talk in the town square back in August, the feeling that Germany was a house with all the doors being locked from the outside, and that they had to break a window just to breathe. He believed it then, and in many ways, he still believes it. But as he carves the tiny wooden mane of the horse, he feels the tragedy of it all. He feels the must of the war clashing with the want of his heart. He is a man caught in a mechanism of necessity, doing his duty with a quiet resilience that doesn't ask for medals, only for the chance to see the forest again. This is the everyday heroism that the history books often skip over, the heroism of keeping one's soul intact when the maps are being redrawn in blood. Johann stops carving for a moment to share a bit of tobacco with the man sitting next to him. They don't speak. They don't need to. In the shared glow of a single match, they see the same thing in each other's eyes, a private fear, a longing for home, and a stubborn, gentle kindness that refuses to die. This is the human reality of the strategic chess. The leaders move the divisions, but the divisions are made of Johanns, each carrying a wooden horse and a heart full of memories. Back in the cities of Germany, the whispers of the storm were felt in a different way. Imagine a woman named Clara, who walks to the market every morning. The shelves are a little emptier each day, and the faces of her neighbors are a little more drawn. Clara is a woman of immense, quiet strength. She spends her afternoons writing letters to her husband and her brothers, filling the pages with the small, beautiful details of life at home. She tells them about the way the cat found a sunbeam on the rug, or how the neighbor's roses are still blooming despite the frost. Clara knows the reasons for the war, the fear that if Germany did not act, it would be slowly suffocated by the empires on either side. She understands the logic of the iron dice. But as she sits by her window in the fading light, she feels the unhealed scars that this struggle is already leaving on the world. She feels a sense of a generational burden, a feeling that this conflict is not just an event, but a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of the human spirit. She worries that the peace they are fighting to protect will be so changed by the fight itself that they won't recognize it when it finally returns. There is a profound, poetic sadness in this moment of history. The strategic chess was played by men who thought they could control the outcome, but the game had taken on a life of its own. The whispers of the next storm were found in the frustration of the stalled advance, in the hardening of hearts, and in the deep, unvoiced realization that the short war was a dream that had vanished with the summer sun. The seeds of future sorrows were being sown in the very soil that Johann was digging, nourished by the tears of women like Clara. As we look back on these unhealed scars of the First World War, we can see the direct lines that connect these quiet nights in the trenches to the even greater shadows that would fall across the world just a few decades later. The frustration, the loss, and the sense of a world gone wrong became the foundation for the next great struggle. It is a journey through history that many of us feel a deep, somber connection to. We honor these stories because they remind us of the fragility of peace and the enduring strength of the people caught in the middle. If you find yourself moved by these tragic histories and want to explore the visual and cinematic ways we honor the past, there is so much to discover. Whether it's through the immersive storytelling of cinematic masterpieces like the movie Midway on Amazon Prime, or by holding a tangible piece of the past through World War II memorabilia, these are powerful ways to keep the memory of that resilience alive. There's a special kind of value in surrounding yourself with these echoes of history, allowing the lessons of the past to sit quietly in our homes and our hearts. I've found that many of you find great peace and reflection in these films and items, and I'd love for you to find something that speaks to you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. I want your exploration of these incredible, tragic histories to be a safe and meaningful journey, guided by the same care we share in these narrations. The night deepened, and the whispers grew louder. In a small village near the front, a young German medic was working by the light of a dim lantern. He was tending to a wounded prisoner, a man whose language he didn't speak. But as he wrapped the bandages and offered a sip of water, the words didn't matter. There was a moment of connection, a small spark of humanity that cut through the strategic chess and the national rivalries. The medic saw not an enemy, but a person who was just as cold and tired as he was. He offered a small, tired smile, and the prisoner reached out a hand in a gesture of silent thanks. This is the heroism that survives the storm, the heroism of the helper, the healer, and the one who remembers that we are all made of the same fragile stuff. This medic, too, was a piece on the board, moved by the why Germany had to start the war logic, but in this quiet room, he was simply a human being. He felt the weight of the war, but he also felt the light of his own compassion. It was a whisper of hope in a world that was beginning to feel very dark. The tragedy of the strategic chess is that it often overlooks these moments. It sees the movement of millions, but it doesn't see the medic's lantern or Johann's wooden horse. It doesn't hear the scratching of Clara's pen or the silent prayers of the man in the trench. Germany felt it had to start the war to save its future, but the future was being changed in ways no general could have predicted. The unhealed scars were not just on the land, but on the soul of a generation. As the fog began to lift in the early hours of the morning, Johann finished the wooden horse. He held it up to the faint light, a small, imperfect thing that represented all the love he had for a world that was thousands of miles away. He tucked it into his pack, next to his letters and his bread. He would carry it through the mud and the wire, a tiny, wooden shield against the gathering storm. He was ready for whatever came next, not because he believed in the grand strategy, but because he believed in the boy who was waiting for a birthday gift. The whispers of the next storm were the whispers of a world that had lost its way, but they were also the whispers of people who were trying, with every ounce of their quiet resilience, to find the way back. They were the whispers of a courage that doesn't need a battlefield to exist, only a quiet room and a heart that remembers how to love. Close your eyes now and listen to the stillness of the night. The storms of the past have faded into the echoes of history, leaving us with these stories to hold on to. The chess pieces have long been put away, but the wooden horses and the letters and the small acts of kindness remain. They are the lights that guide us through our own nights, reminding us of the enduring beauty of the human heart. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the past is remembered with tenderness, and that the quiet strength of those who came before us is a gift that never truly goes out. The night is soft, the story is safe, and you are here, held in the gentle embrace of the memory. A quiet room is sometimes the loudest place in the world. As the first winter of the war began to wrap its icy fingers around the landscape of Europe, a new kind of sound began to settle over the hills and the valleys. It wasn't the sound of the great steam engines or the rhythmic thud of boots on cobblestones that we heard in the earlier days of summer. Instead, it was a heavy, profound stillness, a long silence that stretched from the high, cold offices in Berlin all the way to the smallest, snow-covered cottages in the Bavarian Alps. This was the silence that follows a choice that can never be undone. The men who had played the strategic chess, those who felt they had to cast the iron dice to save their nation from a closing circle of rivals, now sat in rooms filled with the smell of old paper and fading lamp oil. They had made their move. They had acted because they truly believed that to stay still was to be erased. They saw a world where Germany was a fortress under siege, and they felt a desperate, lonely necessity to break out before the walls grew too high. But as the snow began to fall, the maps on their tables seemed to grow cold. The logic of the short war was slipping away, replaced by the reality of a long, quiet wait. Imagine a man named Elias. Before the world was turned upside down, Elias was a bookbinder. He loved the weight of a well-made volume in his hands, the way the leather felt under his thumb, and the quiet dignity of a story preserved for the future. Now, he finds himself in a shallow trench in northern France, wrapped in a coat that never seems to get dry. He is surrounded by a silence so deep it feels like it has a weight of its own. In the darkness, he isn't thinking about the balance of power or the strategic necessity of the Belgian frontier. He is thinking about the sound of his daughter's laughter as she ran through the house. Elias has a small piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper. He isn't drawing a map or recording a military order. He is drawing the outline of a leaf he remembers seeing in his garden. This is his quiet resilience, the refusal to let the grayness of the mud swallow the colors of his memory. He knows that back in his village, the bells are ringing for the evening prayer, and he imagines the sound traveling across the mountains, through the smoke and the wire, to find him here. It is a bridge of silence, a connection between the world he was told he had to protect and the world he actually loves. The silence was felt just as deeply back at home. In the cities, the grand parades had vanished. The cheers of August had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic clicking of knitting needles as women sat together in the half-light of their kitchens. They were making socks and scarves, simple things of wool and care, to be sent into the cold. There was an everyday heroism in the way they kept the hearth fires burning, the way they shared their meager portions of bread with a neighbor whose husband hadn't written in weeks. They didn't speak much of the strategy. They spoke of the price of coal and the way the moon looked so beautiful and indifferent over the rooftops. There is a letter that was found much later, written by a woman named Greta to her brother at the front. She wrote, "The house is so quiet now, Peter. Sometimes I sit in your room just to hear the silence, because it's the same silence you are hearing. I like to think that if we are both very still at the same time, we are standing right next to each other." This was the heart of the long silence, a shared space of waiting, a collective breath held by a nation that felt it had no choice but to step into the dark. Germany's leaders felt that the war was a tragic necessity, a move forced by a world that refused to give them room to breathe. They believed they were fighting for the very existence of this quiet life, for the right to bind books and knit socks and sit by the fire. But the paradox of the chess match was that to protect the silence of the home, they had to create the roar of the battlefield. And now, as the momentum of the first campaign slowed into a frozen standstill, they were left with a silence they hadn't expected, the silence of the long, cold stalemate. As we look back at these moments, we realize that peace is a fragile thing, as delicate as the wings of a moth. We see the strategic maneuvers and the grand designs, but the true history is hidden in the unfiltered reality of the people who lived it. To honor the silent fields of today, we must be willing to look at the raw, uncensored truths of the past. We must see the faces in the mud and the tears in the kitchens without the polish of a textbook. It is this search for the honest, human core of history that drives me to look deeper into the archives, beyond what is usually shown. I want to share these unvarnished moments with you, the ones that show the world as it really was when the cameras were raw and the stories were still fresh with pain and hope. In our Gumroad store, I've curated a collection of unseen, raw media from global conflicts, imagery and records that strip away the grand narratives to show the heartbeat of the people caught in the storm. It's a way to see the shadows and the light of our shared history in a way that feels direct and sincere. Exploring these materials is a powerful way to honor the resilience of those who endured the long silence, and your support there helps me continue this labor of love. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It means so much to me to have you with us on this journey of discovery. The long silence was occasionally broken by small, miraculous moments of kindness. There is a story of a young German soldier who, during a particularly cold night, heard a soft moaning from the strip of land between the trenches. Risking everything, he crawled out into the dark, not with a weapon, but with a small flask of warm water. He found a wounded man from the other side, shivering and lost. In the silence of the night, they didn't speak of nations or alliances. The German soldiers simply held the flask to the other man's lips and stayed with him for a few minutes, two human souls shivering under the same stars. When the soldier returned to his own lines, he didn't tell his sergeant. He kept the moment as a private secret, a small piece of light he had found in the darkness. This was the heroism of the long silence, the ability to see the human being across the wire, to recognize that the chess pieces on the other side were just as cold and tired as he was. It was a realization that the strategic logic that had brought them there was a distant thing, while the warmth of a shared flask was the only truth that mattered. As the winter deepened, the silence became a way of life. The soldiers learned to listen to the different kinds of quiet, the quiet of the falling snow, the quiet of the frozen earth, and the quiet of their own thoughts. They wrote more letters, but the words became simpler. They wrote about the beauty of a frost-covered branch or the way the candle flame danced in the draft. They were stripping away the non-essential, finding the core of what it meant to be alive. They were discovering that even in a world governed by the iron dice, the human spirit has a way of finding its own rhythm. Germany's decision to start the war was a move born of a specific kind of fear, the fear that their voice would be silenced forever by the growing power of their rivals. They chose the roar of the guns to avoid the silence of defeat. But the silence they found was something different. It was a silence of reflection, a silence of endurance, and a silence of profound loss. It was the silence of a generation realizing that the world would never be the same again, no matter how the chess match ended. As the sun sets on this act of our story, let us remember the weight of that silence. Let us think of Elias and his drawing of a leaf, of Greta and her knitting needles, and of the soldier with his flask in the dark. They are the ghosts of the long silence, whispering to us across the years. They remind us that the grand strategies of men are often written in the ink of human tears, and that the only true victory is the survival of our capacity for kindness. The light is fading now, and the world is once again settling into its own long, nightly silence. The fires are being banked, and the stars are watching over the fields that were once so full of movement. The stories of 1914 are becoming the dreams of tonight, a gentle reminder of the resilience of the soul and the fragility of our peace. Close your eyes now and listen to the stillness around you. It is a kind silence, a silence of rest and of memory. The maps have been folded, the chess pieces are still, and the heart is at peace. The long silence is not an end, but a space for us to remember who we are and what we value. Sleep now, and find comfort in the quiet of the past, knowing that the light of those small, everyday heroisms will always find its way through the dark. The night is soft, the story is safe, and you are here, held in the gentle, enduring hush of history.